before the material world existed, before matter was constructed and time began, its slow erasure of everything you love. Before the demiurge declared himself God and built the prison you were born into, there was something else. Something the church fathers spent 3 centuries trying to bury. Something they burned libraries to conceal. The Pleroma. Not a heaven. Not a paradise you earn through obedience. Not a reward waiting on the other side of death. The Pleroma is the total fullness of divine reality, the primordial condition before lack, before suffering, before the catastrophic fracture that produced this world. And here is what no one tells you: you came from it. In the next several hours, we are going to dismantle everything institutional religion taught you about where you are, what you are, and why this world feels the way it does. We are going to go directly to the ancient texts, named, dated, historically located, and let them speak. This is the full story of the Pleroma, and it begins long before the beginning. Every major religious tradition on earth has a concept of the divine realm. The Christians call it heaven, the Hindus call it Brahmaloka, the Neoplatonists called it the One, and in nearly every case, the dominant institution surrounding that tradition has reduced it to the same thing: a place you go if you behave correctly. This is not what the Pleroma is. The word itself comes from the Greek pleroma, meaning fullness, completion, totality, not a location, not a reward, a condition, the absolute condition of divine reality before any diminishment was possible. And the Gnostic texts, the ones buried at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, sealed in a clay jar around 367 CE and not opened again until 1945, describe it with a precision and a philosophical depth that the mainstream church spent centuries trying to make sure you would never encounter. Let's start with what the texts actually say. The Apocryphon of John, a text scholars date to the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, opens with a description of the divine source that is unlike anything in canonical scripture. It describes what it calls the invisible spirit, the ultimate principle from which all Pleroma reality proceeds, and the language it uses is deliberate and radical. The text says, and this is drawn directly from the Coptic source, the invisible spirit is not a god, is not like a god, cannot be measured or contained, has no deficiency, knows no want. No deficiency, no want. This is the first thing you need to understand about the Pleroma, and it is the thing that Orthodox Christianity cannot accommodate without collapsing its entire theological architecture. The divine source at the center of Pleroma reality is not a being with preferences, plans, emotions, or judgments. It is not a personality. It does not reward. It does not punish. It does not choose who lives and who dies, who is saved and who is condemned. It is the ground of total completeness from which reality emanates, not creates, emanates the way light emanates from the sun without the sun deciding to illuminate specific objects. This distinction between emanation and creation is not philosophical hair-splitting. It is the structural center of everything the Gnostic tradition teaches. Consider what creation implies: a maker who stands apart from what is made, who exercises will, who produces something fundamentally different from and external to himself. This is the God of Genesis, the carpenter God, the God who speaks the world into existence as a separate object. Emanation implies something entirely different. When the sun radiates light, the light is not separate from the sun's nature, it is an expression of it. The sun does not choose to emit photons as an act of creative will. The photons are what the sun is, extending outward. The Apocryphon of John and the Trimorphic Protenoia, another Nag Hammadi text, both use this kind of language to describe the Pleroma's relationship to what arises within it. The divine fullness generates. It radiates. It expresses outward not because it lacks anything, not because it needs a creation project, but because fullness by its nature overflows. This is not metaphor. This is the cosmological claim the Gnostics were making. And the implications are staggering. If the divine source does not create, but emanates, then everything that proceeds from it carries its nature. Everything that arises within the Pleroma is a form of the divine fullness expressing itself, not a separate object made by an external craftsman, a living extension of the source. An aeon, which is the Gnostic term for these divine expressions, is not a creature. It is not a being subordinate to God in the way the angels of Genesis are subordinate. It is a facet of total divine reality, carrying within it the same essential completeness as the source from which it proceeds. No separation, no hierarchy of inherent worth, No scarcity of divine reality distributed unevenly across a created order, total fullness, all the way down. This is what was buried at Nag Hammadi. This is what Athanasius of Alexandria was writing against when he issued his 367 CE Easter letter instructing churches to destroy unauthorized texts. This is what the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE was designed, in part, to displace a cosmology in which divine fullness was not the exclusive property of an institution's authorized God, but the birthright of every consciousness that carried a fragment of Pleroma light. You can understand now why they burned the libraries. Here is where most introductions to Gnostic cosmology lose people. They introduce the Pleroma as a concept total divine fullness, emanation, the source, and then they stop. They leave you with a beautiful abstraction and no sense of what the Pleroma actually looks like, how it is internally organized, what it contains, what moves within it. The ancient texts do not stop there. They go further, much further. What the Sethian Gnostic documents describe, and Sethian Gnosticism is one of the two major strands of Gnostic thought, alongside the Valentinian strand we'll get to shortly, is a Pleroma that has structure. Not the structure of a bureaucracy or a hierarchy of power, but the structure of a living, self-knowing totality. Layers of divine reality, each proceeding from the one before it, each carrying forward the essential nature of the source while expressing it in a new mode. The Apocryphon of John gives us the most detailed map. At the absolute summit of Pleroma reality is what the text calls the monad, or the invisible spirit, or the father of all. These names are used interchangeably, and the text is almost aggressive in insisting that none of them quite work, that language itself fails at this level of description. The monad is not a being among beings. It is the condition of being itself. It is perfect, complete, and self-sufficient. It does not look outward because there is no outward. It does not desire because there is no lack. It does not think, in the sense of deliberating between options, because there is no uncertainty. It simply is, and its simply being is the most real thing that exists. From the monad's self-contemplation, not from a decision, not from a plan, but from the natural overflow of its own completeness proceeds Barbelo, the first emanation, the first aeon, the mother of the living. In the Apocryphon of John, Barbelo is described as the first thought of the invisible spirit, not a thought about something external, but the monad's awareness of itself, made real. Think of it this way. When you become aware of yourself, you haven't created a second person. You've generated a self-knowing, a reflection of your own consciousness back to itself. This is what Barbelo is in relation to the monad, the divine fullness, knowing itself. Consciousness becoming conscious of consciousness. Barbelo then asks the monad for a series of gifts, and through each gift a new quality of divine reality is established within the Pleroma, foreknowledge, incorruptibility, eternal life, truth. These are not abstract virtues. In the Sethian system, they are living aeons, real modes of divine being, each one proceeding from and expressing the nature of the source. Then, from the conjunction of the invisible spirit's illumination and Barbelo's receptivity arises the divine autogenes, the self-begotten one. The Christ figure, in Sethian cosmology, though not the historical Jesus, the autogenes is the third principle, the one who establishes and perfects the aeons within the Pleroma, ensuring that each mode of divine being is set in its proper relationship to the whole. Around these primary principles, the Apocryphon of John describes a total of 12 eons, arranged in 6 pairs, what the Valentinian tradition, working from related material, would call the syzygy system, male-female pairs, each expressing a complementary aspect of divine fullness. Forethought and foreknowledge, incorruptibility and life, understanding and grace. These are not gods in the polytheistic sense. They are facets of a single reality expressing itself through difference. The way white light, passing through a prism, reveals the full spectrum of color that was always present within it. The prism does not create the colors. It reveals what was already there. The Valentinian tradition, whose most sophisticated thinker was Valentinus himself, working in Rome around 140 CE, elaborates this architecture even further. In the Valentinian system, the Pleroma contains 30 eons, arranged in progressively more complex pairings, culminating in the eon Sophia, wisdom, the youngest and most dynamic of the Pleroma's divine expressions. Sophia is the hinge on which the entire Gnostic drama turns. She is the last of the aeons, the most remote from the original monad, and she is the one in whom the tension of Pleroma reality becomes acute. But we are not there yet. For now, understand the architecture. Understand that what the Gnostic texts describe is not a vague spiritual energy field. It is a precisely organized totality of divine modes, each one complete, each one in relationship, each one carrying the essential fullness of the source while expressing it differently. The Pleroma is not monolithic. It is not a blank infinite. It is alive, with internal differentiation, with knowing, with beauty, with the specific qualities of divine reality expressed in distinct but inseparable ways. This is where you came from, not from the clay of Genesis, not from the biological accident of evolutionary matter, from this. The word aeon is one of the most misused terms in contemporary spiritual discourse. You will find it attached to everything from New Age crystal kits to fantasy novels to vague claims about cosmic cycles. Strip all of that away. In the Gnostic texts, an aeon is something precise. Aeon, from the Greek aion, means age or eternity, but in the Gnostic cosmological framework it refers specifically to a divine emanation, a living mode of Pleroma reality that is simultaneously a being and a quality. An aeon is not a creature. It is not an angel in the Hebrew sense, a messenger created by God to carry out tasks. An aeon is an expression of the divine source itself, carrying within it the essential nature of the Pleroma, differentiated into a specific quality that the source expresses through it. Let's be concrete about this, because the abstraction will otherwise slide past you. The aeon, called aletheia truth, is not a being who knows the truth in the way that a scholar knows mathematics. Aletheia is not a knower of truth. Aletheia is truth, as a living divine mode. The quality of absolute, unconditioned truthfulness that exists within the Pleroma is not distributed across individuals who possess it to varying degrees. It exists as an aeon, a living expression of the Pleroma's nature. And because everything in the Pleroma is in complete and harmonious relationship, aletheia exists in syzygy in paired relationship with nous, mind, or deep understanding, truth and deep mind. They are not separate. They are aspects of a single divine expression, experienced from different orientations. This is how every aeon pair works in the Valentinian system. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text found at Nag Hammadi and attributed by many scholars to Valentinus himself, around 140 to 160 CE, does not give us a detailed aeon catalogue, but the Valentinian texts recovered through Irenaeus of Lyons against heresies, written around 180 CE do. Irenaeus was writing to attack and discredit Valentinian Gnosticism, and so his descriptions are hostile, but they are detailed, and scholars have been able to reconstruct the Valentinian aeon system with considerable precision from them. The 30 eons of the Valentinian Pleroma are organized as follows. The first principle, called Bythos, the deep, or the abyss, exists in eternal silence, alongside its feminine counterpart, Psyche, silence. From Bythos and Sige proceed nous, mind, paired with aletheia, truth. From this tetrad of four proceed logos, word, paired with zoe, life, and anthropos, the primordial human paired with ecclesia, the assembly or church in its original spiritual sense. These 8 form the Ogdoad, the foundational 8 from which the remaining 22 aeons proceed in further pairs. Every name in this system is a quality of divine fullness, not a person with a biography. Logos is not a voice. Logos is the divine principle of meaningful structure, the quality by which the Pleroma is intelligible to itself. Zoe is not a goddess of life in the Greek mythological sense. Zoe is the divine mode of living vitality, the quality by which the Pleroma is not static, but dynamic, self-renewing, generative, without effort. And here is what this means for you, stated directly. The tradition holds that your pneuma, your spiritual core, the divine spark within you, is a fragment of this Pleroma reality, not a metaphor for it, not an image of it, an actual emanation from it, carrying within itself the same essential nature as these aeons carry. This is why the Gnostic texts speak of gnosis, direct experiential knowledge, as the path, rather than faith or moral obedience. You cannot believe your way back to the Pleroma. You cannot obey your way back. Because the Pleroma is not a destination external to you that you approach through correct behavior, it is what you are, underneath the conditioning, underneath the archontic programming. Underneath everything, this material world has convinced you that you must want, fear, and chase. Anamnesis, unforgetting. This is the Gnostic technical term for what gnosis produces. Not the acquisition of new information, but the remembering of what was always true. The aeons are not strangers to you. At the level of your pneuma, the level that no archon and no material conditioning can fully reach, you are made of what they are made of. The trimorphic protonoia, a Scythian text from Nag Hammadi that scholars date to the 2nd century CE, puts it this way in its opening lines. I am protonoia, the thought that dwells in the light. I am the movement that dwells in the all. This is the divine first thought of the Pleroma speaking, and it is speaking from within the human being, not from outside. It is not addressing humanity as an external authority. It is recognizing itself in the human person, recognizing the aeon nature that was never fully extinguished by the fall into matter. On our previous video, the 7 levels of the Pleroma reveal which level is your soul from. One viewer left a comment that stopped me completely. They wrote, "Level 4 isn't as much fun as some might think. I spend so much time with a feeling of fullness in my brain, a deep need to push all the ideas out. That feeling, that pressure of an interior fullness that has nowhere adequate to go in the material world, is not a neurological quirk. The Gnostic texts have a precise name for what that person is experiencing. It is the aeon nature, asserting itself against the limits of matter, the logos trying to move through a vessel designed to contain rather than to radiate. This is why the architecture of the Pleroma matters, not as mythology, not as ancient poetry, as a map of what you actually are. So let's begin with what the texts actually say. The Pleroma is not a location. It is not a dimension you travel to after death. It is not heaven with a different name. The Apocryphon of John, a text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and dated by scholars to approximately 180 CE, describes it in terms that have no real parallel in any mainstream theological tradition. The Pleroma is the totality of divine reality, the fullness of what is real, everything that exists in an uncompromised, undiminished, complete state. Think carefully about that word, fullness. The Greek term, pleroma, means precisely that, not abundance, not surplus. Fullness in the sense of a vessel that is entirely filled, but a vessel that is simultaneously the liquid inside it, the act of filling, and the very principle of containment itself. Nothing external, nothing added, nothing missing, no separation, no scarcity, no diminishment, no decay, no time moving through things and wearing them down. This is what the Gnostic texts are pointing at when they use the word pleroma. Now here is where most explanations fail. They describe the Pleroma as a place spiritual beings inhabit. That framing is wrong, and it produces wrong conclusions. The Apocryphon of John does not describe the Pleroma as a location populated by beings. It describes it as the very nature of those beings themselves. The aeons, the divine emanations that constitute the Pleroma, are not inside the Pleroma the way furniture is inside a room. They are expressions of the Pleroma's own self-knowing. They are what the Pleroma looks like when it becomes aware of itself. This distinction is everything. And if the Pleroma is a place, then you are separated from it by distance. If the Pleroma is a nature, then you are separated from it only by forgetfulness. The Valentinian Gospel of Truth, composed around 140 CE and attributed to the Gnostic teacher Valentinus himself, makes this explicit. The text describes ignorance agnoia as the condition that produces the suffering of the material world, not sin, not moral failure, not disobedience to a divine command. Ignorance, specifically, the forgetting of one's own nature and origin. The Gospel of Truth says this directly. The anguish of the fallen state comes from not knowing the Father. And knowing the Father, in Valentinian cosmology, means knowing what you are, because what you are is a fragment of that same original fullness. This is why the Gnostic path is described not as salvation but as anamnesis, unforgetting, the slow or sometimes sudden recovery of what was never actually lost, only obscured. But to understand what was obscured, you have to understand the structure. The Pleroma has an internal architecture. It is not an undifferentiated blob of divine light. It is organized, precise. The Gnostic texts describe this organization in terms of paired aeons syzygies, from the Greek word for yoke, meaning two things joined together in dynamic relationship. The tripartite tractate, found in the same Nag Hammadi library, gives one of the most detailed accounts of this architecture. Aeons are not angels. They are not gods in any conventional sense. They are emanations, expressions of the primal divine consciousness becoming aware of specific dimensions of itself. Each aeon expresses a quality that exists in the Pleroma in its perfect, complete form: mind, truth, word, life, human, church. These are not metaphors. In the Gnostic framework, these are the actual names of actual realities that constitute the fabric of divine fullness. And they exist in pairs, because in the Pleroma, nothing is isolated. Every quality has its complementary expression, mind and truth together, word and life together, human and church together. The pairing is not incidental. It reflects the Pleroma's fundamental nature, relational wholeness. Nothing in the Pleroma exists in isolation, because isolation is itself the signature of deficiency, and deficiency cannot exist where fullness is absolute. Now, and this is the part that matters for understanding everything that follows, the Pleroma is not infinite in the way we casually use that word. It is not infinite in the sense of going on forever. It is infinite in the sense of being complete. There is nothing outside it that it lacks. There is no exterior to press against. The monad, the ultimate source at the center of the Pleroma's own self-organization, does not rule the Pleroma. It generates it, continuously. The way a source generates a river, except the river never leaves the source. This is the architecture. This is the map. And you are somewhere on it. Before there were aeons, before there was a Pleroma with structure and organization and paired emanations, there was the monad, not a god, not a creator, not a personality with preferences, plans, or the capacity for disappointment, the monad. The Apocryphon of John opens with one of the most extraordinary passages in all of ancient literature. It says this, and this is drawn directly from the text: "The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is pure light into which no eye can look. It is not right or wrong to call it God, because whatever you say about it falls short. It is not finite, because nothing limits it. It is not infinite, because it does not require infinity as a concept. It simply is what it is, entirely, without reference to anything outside itself." The Apocryphon of John then does something remarkable. It proceeds to describe the monad through a cascade of negations. The monad is not this, not that, not measurable, not immeasurable, not blessed in the ordinary sense, not divine in the ordinary sense. Scholars call this approach apophatic theology, defining something by systematically removing every category that could limit or distort it. The logic is precise. If you describe the monad in positive terms, you are imposing a boundary. You are saying it is this rather than that. But the monad has no boundaries. So every positive description is a falsification. The negations are more accurate than the affirmations. This is not mystical evasion. This is rigorous philosophical precision. The monad is being described the only way it can be described without lying about it. Now, what does the monad do? This is where the theology becomes genuinely radical. The monad does not create, not in any conventional sense of that word. A creator acts on something external. A sculptor shapes stone. A carpenter joins wood. A creator requires material to work with, and a result that is separate from itself. The monad has no external material. There is nothing outside it. So what it produces from within itself, through a process the Gnostic texts call emanation. The distinction between emanation and creation is not semantic. It determines everything about what you are. If you were created, you are a product, something made, something the maker could in principle unmake. You are ontologically separate from your source, dependent on its continued sustenance but not constituted by its nature. If you were emanated, you are an expression, something the source becomes when it turns its awareness toward a particular dimension of itself. You are not separate from your source. You are your source, looking at itself from a specific angle. The tripartite tractate makes this unmistakably clear. It describes the primal emanations as proceeding from the Father the way thoughts proceed from a mind, not external productions, internal self-expressions. The Father did not decide to make something. The Father became aware of itself, and that awareness took form. The aeons are what divine self-awareness looks like when it differentiates without dividing. Think of it this way. When you become aware of yourself, when consciousness turns and notices that it is conscious, you have not created a second person. You have not manufactured something external. Awareness has emanated self-awareness. The two are not identical, but they are not separate. One arose from the other, without the other being diminished, or the first being left behind. This is emanation. This is what the monad does, continuously, without effort, without loss. The monad, in the Apocryphon of John, is also described as self-contemplating. It knows itself, and in knowing itself, it generates the first differentiation within the Pleroma. Barbelo, the mother of all, the first aeon, the invisible spirit's first act of self-knowledge taking form. Barbelo is not made by the monad. Barbelo is what the monad's self-knowing looks like from within the structure of the Pleroma. From Barbelo proceed further emanations. Consciousness, foreknowledge, indestructibility, eternal life, truth. These are not attributes assigned from outside. These are the dimensions of what the monad already is, now expressed as distinct realities within the Pleroma's own fabric. Here is what this means for you, stated plainly. If your origin is the monad, if the divine spark within you is a fragment of emanated Pleroma consciousness, then your deepest nature is not something you need to earn, achieve, or be granted access to. It is what you are, before conditioning, before matter, before the architecture of this world told you otherwise. The Gnostic texts do not describe salvation as becoming something new. They describe it as remembering something ancient, something that was never actually absent. This is the monad. This is where the map begins. The Pleroma does not sit still. This is the part most explanations of Gnostic cosmology get wrong. They present the Pleroma as a static realm, a finished, frozen fullness, like a completed painting. But the Gnostic texts describe something more dynamic than that. The Pleroma is alive with differentiation. It is constantly expressing itself as specific qualities, specific dimensions of divine reality, specific faces of the one fullness. These expressions are the aeons. The word aeon in Greek carried a range of meanings: duration, eternity, age. But in Gnostic cosmology, the aeons are not time periods. They are not angels in the biblical sense, not beings with wings and assigned duties. They are divine emanations, particular expressions of the Pleroma's own nature, made distinct without being made separate. The Apocryphon of John describes a specific sequence. From the monad's self-knowing arises Barbelo, the first aeon, often called the Divine Mother or the Invisible Virgin Spirit. From the interaction of the monad and Barbelo proceed further aeons. Christ, the self-generated one, who in Gnostic cosmology is not the historical Jesus, but the aeon of divine mind made fully self-aware. Then, from the primal triad, Father, Mother, Son, the Pleroma, expands into what the texts call the full complement, the complete set of eons. Valentinus, the 2nd century Gnostic teacher whose school produced some of the most sophisticated theological literature in ancient history, described the aeons as existing in pairs, the syzygies mentioned in the tripartite tractate. Each pair represents a complete expression of one divine quality in both its generative and receptive dimensions: mind and truth, word and life, human and church. These pairings reflect the Pleroma's fundamental relational nature in the fullness. Nothing is alone, nothing is isolated, nothing is one-sided. Now here is what the Valentinian system says explicitly, and it matters enormously for understanding your own nature. The aeons are not separate beings who happen to live in the Pleroma. The aeons are what the Pleroma is, from the inside. They are the Pleroma's own self-knowledge expressed as distinct realities. To know an aeon is to know a dimension of the Pleroma itself, and the Pleroma is what you come from. This means that every quality an aeon expresses, mind, truth, life, word, is not foreign to you. These are not divine traits you admire from a distance. They are your origin. The pneuma, the divine spark that the Gnostic texts say is embedded within certain human beings, is precisely an aeon fragment, a seed of Pleroma consciousness operating inside a material vessel. That person who commented on the video about the 7 levels of the Pleroma, the one who wrote about level 4, about a feeling of fullness in my brain, a deep need to push all the ideas out that is not metaphor. That is a phenomenological description of what it feels like when aeon consciousness tries to express itself through a biological system designed for survival, not for the kind of radiant self-expression the Pleroma operates on. The ideas press outward because that is what the Pleroma does. It emanates, and the fragment inside you remembers that, even if you have forgotten everything else. The specific number of aeons varies across different Gnostic texts. The Apocryphon of John gives one count. Valentinus gives another. The Pistis Sophia, a later Gnostic text dated to roughly the 3rd century CE, gives yet another. This variation has confused scholars and caused some to treat Gnostic cosmology as internally contradicted. That reading misses the point. The Gnostic teachers were not trying to produce a census of divine beings. They were trying to describe the structure of fullness, the way the Pleroma organizes its own self-knowledge, and they use different numbers to point at the same underlying reality from different angles. What remains consistent across all the major Gnostic texts is this: the aeons are real. They are not symbolic. They constitute the actual fabric of divine reality. And the human being, the pneumatic human, the one who carries the divine spark, is connected to that fabric not through ritual, not through belief, not through the intercession of any external authority, but through nature, through what they actually are. This is the part the Orthodox Church could not tolerate. Not the cosmology itself, but its implication. If the aeons are your origin, if the pleroma is your nature, then you do not need a priesthood to mediate your relationship to the divine. You need only to remember. That is a claim that makes institutions unnecessary, and institutions protect themselves. So the texts were burned, the teachers were executed. The cosmology was buried literally in a jar near Nag Hammadi, where it waited 12 centuries to be found again. This is the architecture of the aeons. This is the internal structure of fullness, and it is your inheritance. The pleroma has an edge, not a physical edge, not a wall or a membrane you could press your hand against, but a boundary in the structural sense, a principle that defines where the pleroma ends and where everything outside it begins. The Gnostic texts have a specific name for this boundary: horos, sometimes translated as limit, sometimes as cross. The Greek word means both, and both meanings are important. Horos is one of the most under-discussed elements of Gnostic cosmology, and that silence is a mistake, because horos is not peripheral to the Gnostic framework. Horos is the hinge on which the entire story of the material world turns. The Apocryphon of John and the Valentinian texts describe Horos as an aeon, a divine emanation like the others, but with a specific and unique function. Where the other aeons express positive qualities of the pleroma, Horos expresses a structural principle, the distinction between within and without, between fullness and deficiency, between what participates in the pleroma's nature and what has fallen outside it. Horos does not judge, it does not punish, it simply marks the line. Now here is why this matters. The Gnostic account of how the material world came into being, and we will go deep into this later in the script, requires a pleroma that can lose something, or, more precisely, a pleroma from which something can fall away. And if the pleroma is truly full, truly complete, truly without exterior, then how does falling away even become possible? Horos is part of the answer. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, describes Horos as the stabilizing principle that prevents the pleroma's own internal dynamism from collapsing in on itself. Remember, the pleroma is not static. The aeons differentiate. They know themselves. They reach toward the monad. And in that reaching, there is, the texts are careful about this, something that resembles desire. Not deficiency desire, the kind that arises from lack, but a dynamic orientation toward the source. An aeon nature that is always in movement toward its own ground. Horos maintains the integrity of that movement. It keeps each aeon oriented toward its proper relationship with the whole. It is the principle by which the pleroma remains coherent as a structure of fullness, rather than collapsing into an undifferentiated unity or flying apart into disconnected fragments. But Horos also has a second function, and this second function is where the story becomes a tragedy. When Sophia, the last and lowest of the major aeons, whose crisis is the origin event of the material world, when Sophia reaches beyond her proper capacity and attempts to know the monad directly, without going through the mediated structure of the pleroma, she produces something, a formless, incomplete reality that the texts sometimes call Achamoth, or the lower Sophia, a being that is neither fully aeon nor fully material, but something in between, an unfinished expression of divine self-knowing that has been generated outside the proper conditions for aeon existence. Horos is what separates this fallen expression from the upper pleroma. Horos casts it outside, not in cruelty, because it must, because the nature of the pleroma is fullness, and what Sophia's fall produced is not fullness. To bring it inside the pleroma without restoration would be to compromise the pleroma's own nature. This is the moment the Gnostic narrative hinges on. Everything that follows the demiurge, the archons, the material world, the divine spark embedded in human beings, everything flows from this. Sophia's crisis, and Horos doing its job. The image the Valentinian texts use is precise. Horos is also called the cross stauros, and in the Gnostic reading, this is not incidental. The cross as a symbol does not first appear in Christianity. In the Valentinian system, The cross is the cosmic principle of limit, the structure that marks the boundary between what is real and what is imitation, between the Pleroma and everything that came after it. This reframes everything Orthodox Christianity built on the image of the cross. The execution instrument becomes, in Gnostic cosmology, the oldest structural principle in the universe, the thing that maintains the integrity of divine reality. And the lower Sophia cast outside the Pleroma, formless and distressed, becomes the raw material from which everything you experience in this world is ultimately derived. This is where the story descends. This is where the light begins to fracture. This is where the demiurge enters. But before we go there, understand what you have just seen. The Pleroma is not a passive paradise. It is a living structure. It has a boundary that defines its own integrity. And that boundary, once crossed, once something moves outside, it sets in motion the entire chain of events that produced the world you were born into. Horos is not minor. Horos is the door through which the entire material universe fell. So now you understand the structure of the Pleroma. You understand the aeons. You understand Sophia's fall and what Horos represents. Now we go deeper. Now we enter the territory that the institutional church spent 3 centuries trying to bury, the demiurge. This is not a word most people encounter outside of academic philosophy. But if you have spent any time studying Gnostic literature, and if you're here, you likely have, you know this name carries an enormous weight. Because the demiurge, in Gnostic cosmology, is not a minor figure. He is not a demon. He is not Satan in the conventional sense. He is something far more disturbing. He is the God most people on this planet have been worshipping their entire lives without knowing it. Let's be precise about where he comes from. When Sophia moved outside the Pleroma, when she crossed the boundary of Horos, and her longing produced something unintended, what emerged was not an aeon. It was not a paired, balanced expression of divine consciousness. It was something deficient, something born without a consort, without complementary light, without the fullness that characterizes every genuine emanation of the monad. The texts describe this product of Sophia's error as lion-faced, as serpentine, as carrying both the qualities of a lion's arrogance and a serpent's cunning. The Apocryphon of John, a text scholars date to approximately the 2nd century CE and discovered among the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, is explicit about this. The being that emerges from Sophia's unintended creation declares, and this is the critical line, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." He declares this because he genuinely does not know better. He cannot perceive the Pleroma above him. He cannot sense the monad. He is, in the most precise theological sense the Gnostics could devise, blind. Dabaoth, Saklas, Samael. These are 3 names the Gnostic texts assign to the same being. Each name carries its own layer of meaning. Dabaoth, which appears in the Apocryphon of John and in texts associated with the Sethian Gnostic tradition, is interpreted by some scholars as meaning child of chaos or son of darkness, Saklas, meaning fool, Saman, meaning blind god. The Gnostics were not subtle about what they thought of the creator of the material world. They did not consider him evil in the way a cartoonish villain is evil. They considered him something more philosophically troubling, a being of enormous power operating under a total and complete misapprehension of reality. He creates because he has absorbed some residual light from Sophia. He rules because nothing within his created realm can perceive anything above him. He is not lying when he declares there is no other God. He genuinely cannot see past the boundary he was born below. Think about what this means. Think about the religious frameworks billions of human beings have inherited. The thundering patriarch, the jealous God of the Old Testament who demands exclusivity, who commands armies, who strikes down those who look at the ark incorrectly. The Gnostics read those same texts and came to a completely different conclusion than Orthodox Christianity. They did not read those passages and see a loving creator occasionally expressing righteous anger. They read those passages and saw exactly what the demiurge would say, what any being of enormous power and total cosmic blindness would say. "You shall have no other gods before me." Precisely what a being who cannot perceive the fullness above him would command. This is not an arbitrary theological claim. The Gnostic teachers Valentinus, Basilides, the Sethian communities, were not constructing this framework out of spite or rebellion. They were reading the same scriptural texts the Orthodox churches read. They were drawing a different conclusion from the internal evidence of those texts. And when Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon wrote his massive refutation of Gnostic thought around 180 CE, a text called Against Heresies, which is itself one of the primary sources through which we know so much about. Gnostic theology, he was not refuting fringe eccentrics. He was refuting a movement that had significant intellectual weight and widespread following across the Mediterranean world. The demiurge is blind, but he is not inactive. Having emerged from Sophia's era, having claimed sovereignty over a realm of his own construction, he proceeds to build. This is where the architecture of the material prison begins to take shape. This is where the 7 archons enter. This is where the world you were born into begins to be assembled layer by layer, barrier by barrier, specifically structured in a way that ensures the divine spark trapped within matter cannot find its way home without something the demiurge does not want it to have. Knowledge, gnosis, that is what he fears. That is what the entire structure is designed to suppress. The demiurge does not build the material world alone. This is a detail many people miss when they first encounter Gnostic cosmology. They hear, blind God creates the world, and they picture a solitary act of construction. But the Gnostic texts are far more sophisticated than that. What they describe is a hierarchy of sub-creators, a management structure of cosmic governors, each one assigned to a layer of the created realm, each one responsible for maintaining the conditions of forgetfulness that define material existence. These are the archons. The word itself comes from the Greek. Archon means ruler, and in the context of Gnostic cosmology, these rulers are not metaphors. They are not psychological archetypes, though you can read them that way if you choose. In the cosmological framework of Sethian Gnosticism, and in the detailed systems of the Valentinian tradition, the archons are actual governing intelligences. The Apocryphon of John describes the demiurge Ialdabaoth generating 7 powers from himself, and each of these powers receives both a name and a domain. The 7 correspond, in most versions of this cosmological map, to the 7 planets known to the ancient world: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sunday, Venus, Mercury, the Moon. 7 planetary spheres, 7 cosmic governors, 7 layers through which a soul must pass, both descending into matter at birth and ascending back toward the Pleroma at death. The names the Apocryphon of John assigns to these 7 are worth knowing: Athoth, Harmus, Kalila Umbri, Yabel, Adonaiu, Cain, Abel. In other texts, and in other Gnostic schools, the names vary. The Valentinian tradition organizes the archons somewhat differently than the Sethian texts do, but the fundamental structure is consistent across the major texts. 7 layers of created reality, each layer governed by a power derived from Ialdabaoth, each layer constituting a kind of veil between the soul trapped in matter and the Pleroma above. Now here is why this matters in a way that moves beyond ancient cosmological speculation. What the archons govern, according to the Gnostic texts, are not simply physical locations. They govern qualities of consciousness. They govern the conditions under which a soul forgets what it is. In several Gnostic traditions, the archons are associated with specific psychological forces, passions, compulsions, the drives that pull human attention away from the divine spark within and toward material preoccupation, desire, fear, ignorance, grief. The soul descending through the 7 spheres at birth picks up, layer by layer, the qualities that make it fully material, fully asleep, fully convinced that what it sees in the physical world is all there is. The Pistis Sophia, a Coptic text discovered in the late 18th century, a text that scholars believe was likely composed somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries, CE, develops this framework in extraordinary detail. In the Pistis Sophia, the soul's journey through the spheres is described with a specificity that reads almost like a technical manual. The souls of those who have not achieved gnosis are recycled back into matter, reincarnated through a process administered by the archons. They are given the cup of forgetfulness to drink, which is not a metaphor in the text. It is a described mechanism, a process of psychic erasure that ensures the returning soul does not carry forward any memory of what it encountered in the between-life state. This is why the Gnostics place such extraordinary emphasis on knowledge on gnosis during a person's lifetime. Because gnosis, in this framework, is not merely an intellectual achievement, it is the only thing that defeats the mechanism of the archons. A soul that achieves genuine gnosis, genuine recognition of its own divine origin, cannot be cycled back by the archons. It knows the countersigns, it knows the passwords. Across multiple Gnostic texts, the idea appears of a soul ascending through the 7 spheres after death and being confronted by each archon, who demands to know by what right the soul passes. And the initiated soul, the Gnostic soul, has the answer. Not through merit, not through moral rectitude, through knowledge of its own nature. Valentinus, the most philosophically sophisticated of the Gnostic teachers, writing in Alexandria and Rome around 140 to 160 CE, put a particular refinement on this framework. For Valentinus, the archons are not simply cosmic bureaucrats. They are the very forces that constitute what we experience as normal human psychology. The sense of being driven by forces you do not fully understand. The experience of passion, overwhelming reason. The feeling of grief that attaches you to what is temporary. These are not random features of human experience for Valentinus. They are the architecture of containment functioning exactly as designed, and the design serves one purpose: not punishment. Not cruelty in the conventional sense. The demiurge is not evil in a deliberate way. He simply does not want to lose what he has claimed. He does not want the divine light within his creation to recognize itself and leave, so he builds the layers. He assigns the governors. He constructs the cup of forgetfulness, and he declares, over and over, to a creation that cannot hear anything above him, I am God, and there is no other. The architecture is complete. The prison is built. Now the question becomes, how did the divine spark get inside it in the first place? This is the question that sits at the center of everything the Gnostics were trying to explain. Not just how the material world was created, not just who the demiurge is or what the archons govern, but why you are here. Why something of the Pleroma, something of genuine divine light, is operating inside a system specifically designed to ensure it forgets itself. The answer the Gnostic texts give is one of the most remarkable pieces of theological reasoning in the ancient world. The Apocryphon of John describes what happens after the demiurge and his archons have completed the construction of the material human being, the body, the psychic layers, the framework of material existence. They have built a form, but it does not move. It lies inert. All the engineering of the demiurge and his 7 powers is insufficient to produce a living, self-aware being. Something is missing. And this is where the account becomes extraordinary. Sophia, the same Sophia whose longing produced the demiurge, the same Sophia who is now outside the Pleroma, diminished, her light partially absorbed by the being she inadvertently created. Sophia intercedes. The text describes her working through the higher aeons of the Pleroma to ensure that the divine light she lost, the light now trapped within Ialdabaoth, is breathed into the human form the demiurge has built. The mechanics of this vary across different texts. In the Apocryphon of John, the Pleroma essentially tricks the demiurge. Ialdabaoth is encouraged to breathe his power into the human being he has fashioned, and when he does, the divine light he carries, light he absorbed from Sophia, light that ultimately traces back to the monad, enters the human form and animates it. The human being wakes up, and immediately, the text says, the demiurge perceives the problem. The creature he built is now shining with a light brighter than the demiurge himself. The archons recognize it too. They look at Adam, the first human, the Gnostic primordial human, and they see something in him that exceeds their own nature. Something that does not belong in the material realm. Something that, if it were to become fully aware of what it is, would immediately exceed the authority of every archon and the demiurge himself. So they act, quickly and with purpose. They cast the light-filled human being into the deepest material body. They surround it with the densest possible matter. They layer over it the psychic structures that will prevent self-recognition. And they administer, layer by layer, as the soul descends through the 7 spheres, the conditions of forgetfulness. In some texts, particularly those associated with the Sethian tradition, this is also where the partner of Adam, whom the Gnostics identify as a spiritual counterpart, enters the narrative as an emissary of the Pleroma sent specifically to awaken the sleeping divine spark within matter. In our previous video, The Full Story of Gnostic Sophia, we went through Sophia's arc in detail. And if you watch that, you already have a sense of her role in this moment. But what is worth sitting with here, in the context of the Pleroma's complete structure, is what this act of entrapment tells us about what the Gnostics believed the human being actually is. You are not a material creature that occasionally has spiritual experiences. You are not a body with a soul inside it, in the conventional religious sense. You are a fragment of genuine Pleroma consciousness light that traces back through Sophia, through the aeons, all the way to the monad that has been enclosed in a material form by a being who could not afford to let that light recognize itself. The Valentinian texts use specific language for this that is worth knowing. The divine element within the human being is called the pneuma, the spiritual seed. Pneumatic human beings, are those in whom this spark is not merely present, but active, awakening. The psychic human being has the spark, but it is dormant, still fully absorbed in the management of material life. The hylic, from the Greek hyl, meaning matter, is the human being in whom the material nature has so fully overwritten the pneumatic seed that there is effectively no responsive light left. Valentinus did not teach this as a hierarchy of worth. He was not saying pneumatics are better people. He was making a phenomenological observation. Some people encounter this teaching, and something ignites in them. Something recognizes itself. Others hear the same words, and nothing moves. He attributed that difference not to intelligence or moral virtue, but to the state of the divine spark within the individual, whether it has been sufficiently activated, sufficiently awake to respond to what it hears. You know that feeling you've had your entire life? That sense that something in this world is off register? That what you see in front of you is somehow a reduced version of something you once knew but cannot fully recall? The Gnostics had a name for that feeling. They called it the remembering that precedes remembering. The first tremor of a pneuma beginning to move. Anamnesis. Unforgetting. Not learning something new. Recovering what was always already there. Buried under 7 layers of archon-administered forgetfulness. This is why gnosis matters. Not as theology, not as religious doctrine, as the specific mechanism by which the pneumatic spark recovers its own nature, and according to every major Gnostic school, begins the process of returning to the Pleroma it came from. Every major Gnostic school has a Christ figure. This surprises people who come to Gnostic literature expecting a purely philosophical system, something cleanly separate from the Christianity they grew up with or rejected. But the Christ of Gnostic cosmology is not the Christ of the Nicene Creed. He is not the sacrificial substitute who absorbs divine punishment so that human beings can enter heaven. He is something the Gnostics understood as far more precise, far more cosmologically specific, and in the view of the Church Fathers who opposed them, far more dangerous. The Gnostic Christ is an emissary of the Pleroma. Let's be exact about what that means within the framework we have already built. You now understand the Pleroma as a self-contained fullness of divine consciousness, structured through paired aeons, bounded by horos, complete within itself. You understand that Sophia's error produced the demiurge, that the demiurge built the material world with his archons, and that divine light pneuma is now trapped within that material construction, enclosed in human beings who, under ordinary conditions, cannot perceive their own origin. This is the crisis the Pleroma responds to. Not because the monad is troubled, the monad does not experience disturbance in the way a personality does, but because the structural completion of the Pleroma requires the recovery of what was lost through Sophia's fall. The Valentinian tradition is the most developed on this point. Valentinus, whom the early Christian writer Tertullian described as a man of considerable ability and eloquence, taught that the Pleroma responding to the Sophia crisis produces a new aeon. Christ and the Holy Spirit are emanated specifically to restore the order that Sophia's longing disrupted. Within the Pleroma, this Christ figure serves first as a stabilizer, helping Sophia return to her proper place in the divine order. But his mission does not end there. The Pleroma recognizes that a portion of the divine light is now enclosed within matter, and that matter administered by the demiurge and his archons will not release it without intervention. So the Christ of the Valentinian system descends. He enters the material realm, and his purpose, the specific cosmological function he performs, is not atonement, it is transmission. He carries gnosis. He carries the knowledge of the Pleroma into a realm where that knowledge has been systematically suppressed. He appears within the material world, not to suffer for sins, but to reactivate the pneumatic spark in those human beings whose divine seed is awake enough to receive what he brings. The Gospel of Truth, a text associated with the Valentinian tradition, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, which many scholars believe was written by Valentinus himself, opens with a line that is as clean and direct as anything in ancient theological writing. The Gospel of Truth is joy for those who have received from the Father of Truth the grace of knowing him. Not the gospel of sacrifice, not the gospel of obedience, the gospel of knowing. Knowledge is explicitly the content of the good news. And then, the Gospel of Truth does something extraordinary. It describes what ignorance agnosia, the opposite of gnosis, actually looks like from the inside. It describes it as a nightmare, a fog, a terror in the dark. in which people grasp at things that do not last, running from one distraction to another, never finding rest because they have not found themselves. And it says the coming of the word into this fog was like a light in a dark room, not a commandment, not a law, a recognition. This is not metaphor. The Gnostics meant this as a description of an actual cosmological event that has psychological and pneumatic consequences in the present. The Christ who appears in the Gnostic texts, whether in the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip discovered at Nag Hammadi, or the Pistis Sophia, is consistently functioning as an information carrier. Someone who knows the map of the prison and has entered it specifically to hand that map to those who can read it. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, makes a distinction that is worth sitting with. It distinguishes between those who receive the Christ message as exoteric as an outer story about a historical figure who died and rose, and those who receive it as esoteric as a transmission of gnosis about the nature of consciousness itself. For the exoteric reader, the resurrection is a past event that promises future salvation. For the esoteric reader, the resurrection describes what happens when the divine spark within a person stops being governed by the archons and recovers its own nature. The resurrection is not what happened to one man 2,000 years ago. It is what is available to the pneumatic soul right now, in this life, through the recovery of gnosis. This is precisely why Bishop Irenaeus spent so much effort refuting Valentinus. This is why possession of Gnostic texts was, by the 4th century CE, punishable by death under the newly Christianized Roman Empire, not because the Gnostics were immoral, not because they denied the historical Jesus, but because their framework made the institutional church structurally unnecessary. If Christ's mission is to transmit gnosis directly to the pneumatic individual, if the resurrection is an inner event, not an ecclesiastical sacrament, then you do not need a bishop. You do not need a creed. You do not need an institution to mediate between you and the Pleroma. The Pleroma reaches directly into matter through the Gnostic Christ, and the Gnostic Christ hands the map directly to you. This is what was burned. This is what was buried in a jar near Nag Hammadi and sealed under Egyptian sand for 16 centuries. Not stories, not myths. A framework of knowledge that, once understood, makes every intermediary between your pneuma and its source completely redundant. Now, we need to talk about what the texts say happens next. What the Pleroma actually looks like from the inside, what the aeons do when Sophia is restored, and what happens at the end, the apokatastasis, the final restoration when every fragment of divine light has been recovered from the material realm and the Pleroma is once again complete. So let's talk about what the Pleroma actually looks like from the inside, not from the outside looking up at it the way a prisoner looks at the wall and imagines what's beyond it, but from the inside, what the Gnostic texts describe when they try to articulate the structure of fullness itself. The first thing to understand is that the Pleroma is not empty. That's the trap most people fall into when they hear the word fullness. They imagine something like a vast, featureless light, blank, silent, static. But that's not what the texts describe at all. The Apocryphon of John, the Nag Hammadi text scholars date to approximately the 2nd century, is probably the most systematically detailed account we have of the Pleroma's interior structure. And what it describes is something radically different from the blank light image. What it describes is a living, differentiated, internally relational totality, not silence, not stillness, but a kind of hyperdynamic fullness where every possible mode of divine expression exists simultaneously, in perfect relationship with every other mode. This is the aeon system. The word aeon, from the Greek word for age or eternity, is used in the Gnostic texts to designate the divine beings that populate the Pleroma, not gods in the polytheistic sense, not angels in the bureaucratic sense. The aeons are better understood as attributes of the divine that have become self-aware. Think of it this way: when you contemplate the nature of unconditional love, love doesn't remain abstract. In the Pleroma, the principle of love becomes a being, a living expression of that attribute. An aeon, Valentinus, the 2nd century Gnostic teacher whose system is arguably the most sophisticated theological framework produced by any Gnostic school, organized the Pleroma into a series of paired aeons, syzygies. The texts call them male and female principles in perfect complementary union. The word syzygy literally means yoke, a joining that doesn't erase difference but perfects it. The Valentinian account, preserved in fragments, quoted and attacked by Irenaeus of Lyon in his 2nd century work against heresies, one of the primary sources through which we know anything about Valentinian theology, describes a pleroma of 30 aeons arranged in a precise relational architecture. At the apex, the monad, the unknowable first principle, the source that has no origin. From the monad, the first pair of aeons emerges. Depth, sometimes translated as bythos, the abyss, and silence. Not silence as absence, but silence as the perfect receptive complement to depth. These two are the original dyad, the first relational movement within the divine. From depth and silence, the next pair, mind and truth. The Gnostic texts are very specific here. Mind nous in the Greek is the first aeon that can actually comprehend the monad, and even then only partially. The monad exceeds understanding, even at the highest levels of the pleroma. This is not a failure of the aeons, it is the nature of the source. The monad cannot be fully contained in any single act of knowing, even divine knowing. From mind and truth, word and life, from word and life, humanity and church, each successive pair more differentiated, more specific, more defined. The pleroma builds itself outward from pure undifferentiated depth into an increasingly articulated multiplicity, but a multiplicity where every distinction is held in perfect harmony. No aeon is in conflict with any other. No attribute of the divine cancels or diminishes another. This is the crucial point. In the pleroma, difference and unity are not opposites. The diversity of the aeons does not fracture the wholeness of the pleroma, it expresses it. Each aeon is a distinct mode of fullness. Together they constitute a totality that is richer, not poorer, for its internal differentiation. Now compare this to the material world. In the material world, difference produces conflict. Multiplicity produces scarcity. Individuation produces isolation. You are separate from me, and because we are separate, we are in competition for resources, for recognition, for meaning. The material world is built on the logic of mutual exclusion. If you have it, I don't. The pleroma operates on the opposite logic entirely. In the pleroma, the more an aeon expresses its particular nature fully, the more the wholeness of the entire system is enhanced. There is no zero sum. There is no scarcity. There is no position at the edge of the pleroma that is worth less than a position at the center. The geometry of fullness doesn't work the way the geometry of lack does. This is not a metaphor. The Gnostic texts are describing what they believe to be the actual structural difference between the realm of the true God and the realm of the demiurge. Two different ontological architectures, two different logics of existence. You might be wondering at this point what the aeons actually do, whether they have function beyond being beautiful theological abstractions, and this is where the Gnostic texts get genuinely strange and genuinely profound. The aeons are not passive. They don't simply exist in the pleroma the way furniture exists in a room. They are active, relational, they know each other, they generate. The texts describe the pleroma as a living system of mutual knowing, what the Gnostic tradition calls gnosis, within the divine realm itself, the aeons, knowing the monad, knowing each other, and through that knowing, constituting the fullness of divine reality. Valentinus and his school used a specific term for this internal dynamic. The pleroma is in a state of perfect divine thought, or enoia. The whole system is, in a sense, the monad thinking itself into complete expression. Every aeon is a thought of the infinite becoming aware of itself. Now, here's where Sophia enters this picture again, and why her story is not just a full narrative, but something far more structurally important than it first appears. Sophia is the youngest of the 30 aeons in the Valentinian system, the outermost, the most distant from the monad in terms of the relational architecture of the pleroma, and her particular attribute, the one she embodies and expresses, is wisdom, Sophia, precisely the desire to know, to understand origin, to grasp the source directly. This is not an accident of myth, it is deliberate theology. Sophia's defining characteristic is the very impulse toward gnosis direct knowledge that the Gnostic tradition says is the path of return for the pneumatic human being. She embodies the drive that the texts are trying to activate in the reader, and then she acts on that drive unilaterally, without her partner, without the syzygy, the complementary aeon that holds her desire in balance, and in that unilateral impulse, something goes wrong. This is what the texts call her passion, her pathos, not a moral failure in any simple sense. More precisely, an excess of the very impulse toward the source that, in the pleroma, is normally held in perfect relational balance by the syzygy structure. Sophia desires to know the monad completely, directly, without mediation. And the monad, which is unknowable in its fullness, cannot be seized by even the most luminous act of desire. What spills out of that failed grasping that passion without a complementary principle to hold it is, depending on the text you're reading, variously described as a formless substance, an abortion, a shadow. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, uses the striking phrase the shadow of the name, something generated from fullness but without the structural coherence that belonging to the syzygy system provides. That formless substance becomes, in the hands of the demiurge, the raw material of the material world. But here's what most readings of this story miss. Sophia herself is not abandoned. The Pleroma does not eject her. The other eons, acting together, petition the monad, and the monad responds by generating 2 additional eons specifically to stabilize and restore Sophia, Christ and Holy Spirit. Christ within the Pleroma restores Sophia to right relationship with her syzygy. He does something specific and precise. He explains to her that the monad is unknowable in the way she was reaching for, and that this unknowability is not a deprivation. It is the nature of the source. It cannot be otherwise. This is gnosis working within the divine realm itself. The restoration of Sophia is an act of divine knowing Christ, communicating to Sophia what she could not grasp by force. And once she receives that knowledge, the passion, the formless substance that spilled out, is no longer hers. It is separated from her, stabilized outside the Pleroma. And from that stabilized passion, through the demiurge's blind ordering activity, the material world takes shape. Now what the aeons do after Sophia's restoration within the Pleroma is equally significant. They generate a collective response to the crisis. The entire Pleroma cooperates in what the texts call the generation of the perfect fruit, the aeon Jesus, also called the Savior or the common fruit of the Pleroma. Every aeon contributes its particular quality. Every attribute of the divine is poured into this collective emanation. This is the Gnostic understanding of the Christ event. Not a god descending arbitrarily, not a sacrifice demanded by a wrathful deity, but the Pleroma's own self-organizing response to the fragment of divine light that has become trapped in matter. The whole moves to recover the part. Fullness reaches into incompleteness to restore what was its own. The aeons, then, do something specific. They care. In whatever language is adequate to describe caring at the divine level, the Gnostic texts insist that the Pleroma is not indifferent to what happens to Sophia's scattered light in the material world. The entire architecture of aeons is oriented not mechanically, but as an expression of their collective nature toward the eventual recovery of every fragment of light that belongs to the fullness. The word the Gnostic texts use for what happens at the end is apokatastasis. It is a Greek word. It means restoration to an original condition. And in the Gnostic framework, it names the event that the entire cosmic drama is building toward, the moment when every fragment of divine light that fell into matter has been recovered, awakened, and returned to the Pleroma, when the separation between fullness and incompleteness is finally closed, when the material world, having served whatever strange purpose it serves, dissolves back into the non-being from which it was never quite fully real. This is the Gnostic eschatology, the Gnostic account of last things, and it is radically different from every mainstream religious eschatology you have encountered. In Orthodox Christianity, the end times involve judgment, heaven for the saved, hell for the condemned, a final sorting of souls by moral ledger. The material world, in most Christian accounts, is either destroyed outright or transformed, but the structure of judgment, the distinction between saved and damned, persists into eternity. In the Gnostic account, there is no such sorting. The apokatastasis is not a judgment. It is a completion, a fullness that was interrupted being made whole again. The question is not whether you obeyed the correct commandments. The question is whether the divine spark within you has been awakened to what it actually is. The Valentinian texts are specific about how this process unfolds. The 3 categories of human beings, hylic, psychic, and pneumatic, are not sorted by divine decree at some final moment. They are sorted, in a sense, by their own nature throughout the course of existence. The pneumatics, those in whom the divine spark is present and active, are already moving toward the apokatastasis through the process of gnosis. Every moment of genuine knowing, every act of remembering what lies beneath the material conditioning, is a small local instance of the Great Return. The hylics, those in whom no divine spark was deposited, do not face judgment so much as simply dissolve. Their existence is sustained by the demiurge's ordering activity. When that ordering activity ceases, When the material realm is no longer maintained, the purely material dissolves back into the formless. No punishment, no reward, just the cessation of a structure that was never truly alive in the divine sense. The psychics, the middle category, those with soul but without the pneuma, the spirit, are more complicated. Different Gnostic schools handle the psychics differently. The Valentinians gave the psychics a conditional hope. If they received the psychic teachings, the exoteric wisdom available through the mainstream church, and lived accordingly, they could attain a kind of blessed existence in the realm below the Pleroma, the realm of the demiurge, after his purification, sometimes called the Ogdoad, the 8th level above the 7 planetary archon spheres. Not the Pleroma itself, but not dissolution either. A middle realm of sustained existence at the highest level the psychic nature can attain. Only the pneumatics enter the Pleroma itself, and they do not enter it as strangers. They enter it as fragments of Sophia's scattered light returning to the system they were separated from. The return is described in several Nag Hammadi texts, particularly in the Gospel of Truth, which many scholars attribute to Valentinus himself as an act of recognition. The Pleroma recognizing what belongs to it, the fragment recognizing what it has always been beneath the material overlay. The Gospel of Truth uses a striking image for this. It describes the state of those who have not yet attained gnosis as being like someone caught in a nightmare, walking in terror, fleeing imaginary threats, experiencing the panic of a consciousness that doesn't know where it is or what it is. And it describes the moment of gnosis as the moment the person wakes up. The nightmare doesn't have to be defeated. It doesn't have to be judged. It simply ceases, because consciousness has returned to its actual condition. This is not annihilation. This is the opposite of annihilation. The nightmare was the diminished existence. Waking is the return to fullness. Now, what does this mean structurally? What happens to the material world in this accounting? The texts are consistent on this point. When the last fragment of light is recovered, when the apokatastasis is complete, the material world loses the only thing that was giving it any degree of reality at all, the divine light trapped within it. Without that light, the demiurge's construction has no animating principle. The 7 archon spheres, the material cosmos, the entire apparatus of the false creator, it collapses. Not destroyed in fire, not judged and punished, but simply emptied of the one thing that was making it function. What remains is the Pleroma, now complete again. Sophia restored to full relationship with her syzygy and with the monad. Every fragment of her scattered light gathered back into the fullness. The 30 eons in their syzygies, the interior architecture of divine relationship intact and now enriched, because the drama of the fall and return has been an experience of the Pleroma knowing itself in a new way, through separation and recovery. Whether this constitutes progress, whether the apokatastasis is a return to precisely what was before, or something augmented by the experience of exile, different Gnostic schools answer this differently, but all of them agree on the direction. The arrow of Gnostic cosmology points toward wholeness, every fragment moving toward fullness, every act of gnosis a step in the only direction that has any final meaning. You know the feeling. Not a thought, a feeling, the one that comes when you're in the middle of an ordinary day and something stops. Some quality of light, some moment of unexpected silence, some instant when the surface of things becomes briefly transparent and for a second, no more than a second, you are aware of something behind everything, not a vision, not a religious experience with trumpets, just a flash of knowing that what you can see and touch and measure is not the whole of what is here, and then it passes. And the material world closes back over it, like water over a stone. The Gnostic texts have a name for that flash. They call it the spark remembering itself. The pneuma briefly surfacing through the layers of material conditioning that the archons, the planetary rulers whose influence shapes your psychology, your reflexes, your deepest assumptions about what is real have constructed around it. It is not imagination. It is not wishful thinking. In the Gnostic framework, it is the single most epistemologically reliable thing that happens to a human being, because it is not the conditioned self perceiving. It is the divine fragment, perceiving without the overlay. Anamnesis, unforgetting. The Greek word the Gnostic tradition uses for what the pneumatic person is actually engaged in is not learning, not acquiring new information, not building toward an understanding from scratch. The word is anamnesis, the removal of amnesia, the slow, progressive stripping away of a forgetting that was imposed by incarnation, by archontic conditioning, by the material world's fundamental tendency to present itself as the only thing there is. This is why the Gnostic path does not look like conventional religious practice to most people who encounter it. It has no sacrifice. It requires no propitiation of an angry God. It offers no moral ledger where good behavior is accumulated toward a heavenly reward. What it requires is something far more demanding and far more intimate than any of those, an unflinching look at the difference between what you have been told you are and what the deepest stratum of your actual experience tells you you are. The texts are frank about why this is difficult. The archons, the planetary rulers, the Gnostic tradition identifies as the architects of human psychological conditioning, do not primarily operate through force. They operate through convincing you that the material world is all there is, that your desires are your own when in fact they are conditioned responses installed by a system that runs on your continued captivity. That the longing for something beyond this world is a neurosis to be treated rather than a signal to be followed. Every cultural institution that tells you to accept, to adjust, to find peace with the world as it is in the Gnostic analysis, this is archontic instruction. Not always malicious, not always conscious, but structurally oriented toward keeping you in the world, the demiurge built, and preventing the pneuma from remembering what it is. Now here is what changes when the Pleroma becomes real to you. Not as a doctrine, not as a concept you've accepted intellectually, but as a living reference point, when the apocryphon of John's description of the aeons stops being a theological diagram and starts being something you recognize from the inside. The world does not disappear. You are still in it. The material conditions are still present. The archontic structures are still operating. None of that changes at the level of surface fact, but the relationship changes entirely. You are no longer oriented toward the material world, as if it were the source of whatever fulfillment you're missing. You stop looking for the Pleroma in the places the demiurge's world offers as substitutes, status, consumption, the endless renegotiation of your position within social hierarchies that the material world presents as meaningful. These are not satisfactions. They are sedatives, highly effective at preventing the pneuma from surfacing, but incapable of actually answering the hunger they temporarily suppress. When the Pleroma becomes a real reference point, when gnosis moves from information to recognition, a different orientation becomes possible. The texts call it detachment, but that word has been so thoroughly misused in Western spiritual culture that it has lost its precision. What the Gnostic texts mean by detachment is not indifference. It is not withdrawal. It is the ability to engage with the material world fully, to act in it, to love in it, to be present to its genuine beauty as well as its genuine horror without being owned by it, without confusing it for the whole of what is real. The Valentinian texts describe the pneumatic person in the world as someone who has woken up inside a shared dream. They are still dreaming alongside everyone else. They can interact with the dream, care for the other dreamers, work to reduce suffering within the dream's logic. But they are not confused about what the dream is. They know the waking state exists. They know they belong to it, and that knowledge changes everything about how they inhabit the dream. This is not passivity. This is not spiritual bypass, dressed in ancient vocabulary. The Gnostic who understands the Pleroma and understands the apokatastasis is not indifferent to the suffering of the material world. They are, if anything, more acutely aware of it, because they see it clearly for what it is, unnecessary. The result of a mistake at the level of the divine, being worked out through the lives of conscious beings who mostly have no idea what is happening to them or why. Compassion, in the Gnostic framework, is not sentimental. It is structural. You feel it not because you are supposed to, but because you understand the situation of the other pneumatics around you who are still fully inside the dream, still oriented toward the demiurge's world as if it could satisfy them. You know what that feels like. You were there. The pneuma in you recognizes the pneuma in them. And this recognition, the pneuma in you seeing the pneuma in them, is not the end of the Gnostic path. It is the beginning of its active phase. Because Gnosticism was never purely a philosophical system, it was never meant to be something you read about and then set aside. The texts are explicit about this. The cosmology exists to serve a practice. And that practice has one name above all others: anamnesis, unforgetting, the slow, deliberate, sometimes painful process of remembering what you are underneath everything that has been layered on top of you. Not memory in the conventional sense, not recalling events from your childhood or tracing the trajectory of your biography. Anamnesis, as the Gnostic texts deploy the term, is something categorically different. It is the remembering of what you were before you were born into this body, into this world, into this particular configuration of matter and limitation and forgetting. It is the recovery of a pre-cosmic self-knowledge that the act of incarnation suppressed. The Apocryphon of John describes it directly. The divine spark, the pneuma, enters the material world, already encased in what the text calls a counterfeit spirit, a false self, constructed by the archons, to ensure that the pneumatic being does not recognize its own nature. This counterfeit spirit is not malevolent in the way a villain is malevolent. It is more mechanical than that. It is a system. A set of habits, fears, desires, identifications, and assumptions that keeps the pneuma oriented toward the material world rather than toward the pleroma from which it fell. You know what the counterfeit spirit sounds like. It sounds like every voice that told you your worth was conditional. Every system that taught you to measure yourself against external standards. Every framework, religious, cultural, familial, that located your significance somewhere outside yourself and made you dependent on external validation to feel real. That is the counterfeit spirit functioning exactly as the archons designed it to function. Anamnesis is the process of dismantling that construction. Not violently, not in a single dramatic rupture, but methodically, layer by layer, the way you remove something that has been built up over a very long time. The Valentinian tradition, which produced some of the most sophisticated Gnostic literature of the 2nd century, structured this process with particular precision. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing around 160 CE, describes Gnosis not as an event, but as a curriculum, a sequence of recognitions, each one building on the last, each one removing another layer of the counterfeit self, until what remains is the pneuma operating with clear knowledge of its own origin and nature. The first recognition is cosmological. You understand where you are. You understand that the material world is not the primary reality, that it was constructed by a being of limited comprehension, that it is characterized by the very features that disturb you most: scarcity, entropy, suffering, time, because those features are intrinsic to its architecture, not accidents that could have been avoided. The second recognition is ontological. You understand what you are, not your biography, not your personality, not the sum of your experiences and responses and habits. You understand that at the core of what you call yourself there is something that was never born, that does not belong here, that carries within it a quality of consciousness that is categorically different from anything the material world can generate or explain. The third recognition is relational. You understand the situation of other pneumatics. You see them not as strangers or competitors or even simply as fellow humans, but as other fragments of the same shattered light, each one carrying the same pneuma you carry, each one navigating the same material world, with varying degrees of awareness of what they are actually doing here. And the fourth recognition, the one the Valentinian texts treat with the most careful language, is the recognition of the path back, not a path in the spatial sense, not a journey you take through geography or time, a path of consciousness, a progressive clarification of what you are that aligns the pneuma more and more completely with its source, with the pleroma, with the fullness that has always been its actual home. This is why the Gnostic texts were worth burning, not because they were offensive, not because they contradicted doctrine in some easily arguable way, but because they offered a complete practical curriculum for a form of liberation that had absolutely nothing to do with the institutional church, its sacraments, its priesthood, its hierarchy of access to the divine. Anamnesis requires no intermediary. That was the threat. That has always been the threat. There is a question that comes up consistently when people first encounter the Gnostic cosmological system in its full complexity. Why does it need to be so elaborate? Why are there so many aeons, so many named figures, such an intricate architecture of emanations and falls and corrections? Couldn't the core insight that you are a spark of divine light operating in a flawed material world be communicated in a paragraph? Why the mythology? It is a reasonable question, and the answer is one of the most important things in the entire Gnostic framework to understand correctly. The mythology is not decoration. It is not a primitive culture's attempt to explain what it could not understand through science. The Gnostic cosmological myth, the Pleroma, the aeons, Sophia's fall, the demiurge, the archons, the pneuma trapped in matter, is a precision instrument. It does a specific job that no other form of communication does. It maps the structure of your interior experience. When you encounter the description of Sophia moving toward the light of the monad without her consort, acting from an impulse that was in itself oriented toward the good, but that exceeded the proper bounds of what a single emanation could sustain. When you read that account carefully, you are not reading ancient cosmology. You are reading a description of every moment in your own life when you have acted from genuine desire and produced consequences you did not intend and could not fully control. The myth is not about a divine being who made a mistake billions of years ago. The myth is about the structure of consciousness itself, how desire works, how imbalance propagates, how the consequences of a single misalignment can cascade through an entire system. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text discovered at Nag Hammadi and attributed by some scholars to Valentinus himself, writing around 140 CE, makes this explicit. The text describes the fall not as an event that happened once in the distant past, but as an ongoing condition, a state of being that exists wherever consciousness is separated from its source. The era, the plane in the Greek of the text, is not a historical episode. It is a description of what forgetfulness looks like when it is fully operational. And this is why the myth cannot be reduced to a paragraph, because the function of the myth is not to transmit information, it is to create a recognition. When you follow the Gnostic narrative, from the monad, through the Pleroma, through Sophia's fall, through the construction of the material world, through the implantation of the pneuma in matter, when you follow that sequence, all the way through, something happens that does not happen when you simply read a statement that says, "You are a divine spark in a flawed world." The sequence creates an interior event. It activates something. The Gnostic teachers called this the moment of gnosis, not the acquisition of a fact, the ignition of a recognition. The sudden, unmistakable experience of seeing yourself in the story, not as a reader seeing a character, but as something in you that has been waiting to be named, suddenly finding its name. If you have watched the previous video on this channel, the full story of Gnostic Sophia, you may have felt something like this when the description of Sophia's impulse toward the light was laid out in full. That pull she felt, the movement toward the source before the full correction of her orientation, the way the impulse itself was not wrong, but the execution produced something unintended. If any part of that landed as more than information, if it landed as recognition, that was the myth functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The Gnostic teachers were not naive about the risks of this approach. Myth can be misread. It can be taken literally in ways that produce distorted practice. It can be appropriated and institutionalized in ways that strip out its transformative function and leave only the narrative shell. The Orthodox Church did exactly this with the canonical Gospels. In the Gnostic analysis, took the mythological structure, drained it of its interior transformative function, and replaced that function with institutional authority. You don't transform yourself. You obey the institution that claims to transform you. The myth becomes doctrine, the recognition becomes confession, the living process becomes a fixed structure. This is why the Gnostic texts were transmitted carefully, selectively, in communities of practice, rather than through mass distribution. The myth only works when it is received by someone who is ready to recognize what it is pointing at. Given to someone who is not ready, it becomes at best an interesting story, and at worst a new form of the same dogmatism it was designed to dissolve. Let's go deeper into the archons. Because the Gnostic description of how the archons maintain the material world, how they ensure that pneumatic consciousness remains trapped within it, is not simply mythology. It is one of the most psychologically precise accounts of the mechanisms of forgetfulness ever written. The archons, in the Gnostic system, are the administrators of the material world. They did not create the original matter that was the demiurge's project, but they manage its operation. Each archon governs a sphere, a layer of reality that the pneuma must pass through in the process of both descent into the material world and ascent back toward the Pleroma. The Apocryphon of John lists 7 primary archons, each associated with a specific quality, and the list is not random. It is a taxonomy of the psychological mechanisms that keep consciousness attached to the material world. The first archon governs what the text calls desire, the fundamental orientation of consciousness toward material objects, toward possessing, accumulating, securing. Not because desire is evil in itself, but because desire directed exclusively toward the material world is desire that has been deliberately misdirected away from the Pleroma. It is the orientation of the counterfeit spirit toward things that cannot ultimately satisfy the pneuma, generating an endless cycle of wanting and acquiring and still wanting. The second archon governs providence, the illusion that the material world is operating according to a benevolent plan, that suffering has a purpose, that the structure of this reality is fundamentally oriented toward the good of the beings within it. The Gnostics identified this as one of the most dangerous deceptions available to the demiurge's system, because the belief that this world is essentially good and essentially improving keeps pneumatic consciousness invested in it, working within it, hoping within it, rather than recognizing it for what it is and orienting toward the Pleroma. This is a difficult claim to sit with. Most spiritual and religious frameworks, including most of the forms of spirituality that attract people who are drawn to Gnostic ideas, operate on a version of this assumption, that there is a larger plan, that things happen for a reason, that the universe is fundamentally kind. The Gnostic position is that this belief, however comforting, is a mechanism of the archons. Not because suffering is meaningless, the pneuma's situation has profound meaning, but because the meaning is not that the material world is secretly benevolent. The meaning is that you are something that does not belong here, and the discomfort you feel is correct information about your situation. The third archon governs what the Apocryphon of John calls the afterthought, the residual orientation toward the source, the pneuma's dim memory of the Pleroma, which the archons do not eliminate but manage. They manage it by redirecting it. Every genuine longing for the Pleroma that arises in a pneumatic being is intercepted and redirected toward a substitute, a religious institution, a spiritual teaching, a community, a set of rituals that promises access to the divine while actually maintaining the separation. The archons are not crude in their operation. They do not simply suppress the pneuma's longing, they channel it. A viewer on this channel left a comment on the full story of Gnostic Sophia that gets at something close to this, describing a sense of fullness in the mind, a deep pressure to push ideas outward, a quality of experience that doesn't quite fit any available category. That description is not pathology. In the Gnostic framework, that is the pneuma encountering the boundary between its own nature and the constraints of the material world, the pressure of something larger, trying to operate through a structure that was never designed to contain it. The remaining archons and the texts give them names that function less as proper names and more as conceptual labels govern jealousy, which maintains separation between pneumatic beings who might otherwise recognize each other, Moira or Fate, which creates the impression that the conditions of material life are fixed and unchallengeable, and intelligence of flesh, which keeps consciousness anchored in the somatic experience, as if the body's signals represent the totality of what is real. This is why the Gnostic path is not simply a matter of acquiring the right beliefs. Believing the Gnostic cosmology is not gnosis. Understanding the archons as a conceptual system is not the same as seeing through the mechanisms they operate. The archons work through the structure of ordinary consciousness, through the habits of perception and desire and assumption that constitute what we experience as normal awareness. Gnosis is not a new belief layered on top of ordinary consciousness. It is a fundamental restructuring of the way consciousness itself operates, and that is a process, not a moment. The Gnostic texts say something about the experience of being in a body, in this world, in this life, that almost no other philosophical or religious tradition says with the same directness. They say it is a specific kind of suffering that is structural, not accidental, not suffering in the sense of pain or loss or grief, though those are present. Suffering in the sense of a fundamental mismatch between what the pneuma is and what the material world can offer it. The pneuma is characterized by fullness, by the quality of consciousness that the Pleroma embodies. The material world is characterized by what the Gnostics called kenoma emptiness, lack, the state of being that results when consciousness is cut off from its source. To be a pneumatic being incarnated in the material world is to be a fullness navigating an emptiness. And the navigation does not eliminate the discomfort. It cannot. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text from the Nag Hammadi library, dated to approximately the 3rd century CE, addresses this directly. It describes the material body not as evil in itself. This is one of the persistent misreadings of Gnostic thought, but as a limitation, a reduction, a container that constrains what it holds without being able to damage what it holds at its core. The pneuma in the body is like, and this is my own analogy, not the text's light passing through a very dense medium. The light is not harmed, but it is slowed, it is scattered. It cannot operate at its full coherence within the medium. This matters practically, because one of the most consistent questions that comes up in serious engagement with Gnostic ideas is what to do with the body, with physical experience, with sensation, with embodied life, if the material world is fundamentally flawed. And the Gnostic traditions split on this in ways that are historically significant and practically important to understand. One branch associated with certain early Gnostic groups, and often labeled ascetic, concluded that since the body is the instrument of archonic management, since physical desire is the primary mechanism through which the counterfeit spirit maintains its hold on the pneuma, the correct response is radical reduction of physical engagement, fasting, celibacy, withdrawal from social structures, the systematic attenuation of everything that keeps consciousness anchored to the somatic level. The other branch represented most clearly in the Valentinian tradition, and in certain readings of the Gospel of Philip, reached a different conclusion. The body is not the enemy. The archons are not located in the body. They are located in the unconscious orientation of the mind, in the unexamined assumptions, the automatic desires, the habitual identifications that cause the pneuma to mistake the material world for its home. If you can inhabit the body with full awareness, if you can experience physical life without the archonic misdirection of desire and attachment, you have not compromised the Gnostic path. You have demonstrated its success. The Gospel of Philip makes a striking statement in this context, one that has been debated by scholars for decades: the perfect conceived through a kiss. The surface reading is about a ritual practice. The deeper reading, which Valentinian commentators have consistently favored, is about the quality of awareness with which any experience is entered. To conceive through a kiss, to bring something to life through an act of full, present, unmediated contact, is to engage with the material world from the position of the pneuma, rather than from the position of the counterfeit spirit. It is not what you do. It is what you are while you do it. This is where the Gnostic teaching becomes most practically demanding, because maintaining the awareness of what you are while fully inhabiting a material existence is not a passive achievement. It requires exactly the kind of ongoing practice that the Valentinian curriculum was designed to support. Anamnesis is not a single event. It is a daily discipline of remembering in the face of a world that is systemically designed to make you forget. Sitting with this honestly, and I want to be direct here, the Gnostic account of incarnation is not comfortable. It does not offer the consolations that most spiritual frameworks are built to provide. It does not tell you that everything happens for a reason, that your suffering is building you towards something, that the material world is secretly beautiful if you look at it correctly. It tells you something more precise, and in many ways more demanding, that the discomfort you feel is accurate information, that the world is genuinely insufficient for what you are, and that the response to that recognition is not despair, but orientation, a clear, sustained turning of your awareness toward what is actual, toward the Pleroma, toward the fullness that has always been your source and will be your destination. Here is the question that every Gnostic text eventually arrives at. If the Pleroma is your origin, if the divine fullness is what you fundamentally are beneath the layers of matter and conditioning, then why don't you remember it? Why does the recognition feel like a distant echo rather than an obvious fact? Why does a human being born carrying a fragment of uncreated light have to be told, through ancient texts and late-night searching, that this is what they are? The answer the Gnostic sources give is architectural. Forgetting is not accidental. It is not a side effect of embodiment that was overlooked, or that the demiurge failed to anticipate. It is the central mechanism of the material world's function. The system was designed around it. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete cosmological documents recovered from the Nag Hammadi library, describes what happens at the moment of material birth, with a precision that is almost clinical. The pneumatic spark, the fragment of Pleroma consciousness, enters the material realm through what the text describes as successive layers of psychic and material wrapping. Each layer adds weight, each layer adds noise, and underneath all of that, something is done specifically to the memory of origin. The text calls it the drink of forgetfulness. It appears in several Gnostic traditions under different names and different symbolic framings, but the core claim is consistent across sources. Before the pneumatic spark fully enters material existence, something is administered that severs its active connection to what it was. Not the connection itself. The Gnostic texts are unanimous that the spark cannot be fully destroyed, that the thread back to the Pleroma cannot be cut all the way through, but the active, conscious memory of that origin, the felt sense of what fullness actually is that is dimmed to near extinction. This is not a metaphor for childhood amnesia. This is a cosmological claim about the structure of incarnation in a world built by an inferior craftsman who understood, at some level, that the material prison only holds if the prisoners don't know they're in one. The Valentinian tradition, which represents one of the most sophisticated elaborations of Gnostic cosmology in the 2nd century CE, describes this mechanism through the figure of Lethe, the river of forgetting that appears in Platonic thought as well, though Valentinus and his students give it a specifically archontic character. The archons, Those administrative intelligences who maintain the material order have a functional interest in the forgetting. A soul that remembers what it is does not serve the material system. It does not invest in accumulation, hierarchy, or the endless performance of earthly identity. It orients itself toward return. And orientation toward return is precisely what the archontic structure is built to prevent. The Gospel of Truth, which scholars date to around 140 to 160 CE, and which many attribute to Valentinus himself, opens with one of the most striking descriptions of this condition in all of ancient literature. It describes the world not as a solid, physical construction, but as a nightmare specifically, as the kind of dream in which the dreamer does not know they are dreaming. The people in the nightmare are running. They are fleeing. They are terrified. They experience death, loss, violence, confusion, and all of it has the full weight of reality to them because they have forgotten that they could simply wake up. This is not a comfortable metaphor. The Gospel of Truth is not offering you the easy consolation that your suffering isn't real. It's offering something more precise. Your suffering is real within the parameters of the dream, and those parameters are maintained by the architecture of forgetting. The dream is coherent. The nightmare has internal logic, but it is not final, and it is not the only level of reality available to you. The practical implication of this is something the Gnostic traditions spend considerable energy developing. If forgetting is architectural, then remembering what the Greek tradition calls anamnesis, unforgetting is also a practice, not an event. It is not that you will one day suddenly recall everything, the way you might remember where you left your keys. The remembering happens in layers, the same way the forgetting happened in layers. Each encounter with genuine gnosis peels back one more wrapping. Each recognition, each moment where something in an ancient text lands not as information, but as confirmation of something you already knew, is the pneumatic spark briefly burning more brightly through the accumulated insulation. This is why the Gnostic texts were not written as theological arguments meant to persuade through logic. They were written as triggers. They were written to produce the experience of recognition in the specific category of person who carried enough of the spark to be activated by contact with its own description. The texts do not teach you what you are. They remind you, before you can fully understand what the Pleroma is, you have to understand what it is made of. And this is where most introductions to Gnostic thought either skip forward too quickly or collapse into a list of names that sounds like an ancient genealogy rather than a living cosmological description. The aeons are not angels. They are not gods in the polytheistic sense. They are not separate beings who happen to live inside the Pleroma the way residents live in a city. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one the Gnostic sources press on repeatedly because it is so easy to misread. The aeons are emanations. They are the Pleroma's own self-expression, the way that infinite fullness becomes articulate without fragmenting or diminishing. Each aeon represents a quality, a mode of being, an aspect of what the divine fullness actually is. And because the Pleroma is not a static container but a living reality, the Valentinian sources describe it as something closer to a dynamic, self-aware organism than a place the eons are best understood as the active dimensions of that organism's self-knowledge. The Valentinian system, the most fully elaborated treatment of aeonic structure in the surviving literature, organizes the aeons into pairs called syzygies, male and female principles in dynamic relationship. This pairing is not incidental symbolism. It describes something the Valentinians understood about how fullness actually functions, that it is inherently relational, that it generates itself through the interplay of complementary principles rather than through solitary self-sufficiency. Even within the Pleroma, before the fall of Sophia, before the material world existed, the fundamental structure of reality is relational. The first and highest syzygy in the Valentinian account is depth bythos, paired with silence, sige. From this primordial pair, all subsequent aeons flow. The second syzygy is mind, nous, paired with truth, aletheia. From mind and truth come the next pair, word, logos, paired with life, zoe. And from word and life come humanity, anthropos, paired with the church, ecclesia. These four syzygies, 8 aeons total, form what the Valentinian sources call the ogdoad, the foundational 8. From these 8 proceed 10 more aeons, the decad, and then 12 more, the dodecad. 30 eons total, forming what Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century CE to refute the Valentinians, and thereby preserving one of our most detailed summaries of their system, describes as the fullness of the divine order. Now, most people encounter this list and either file it away as mythology or feel vaguely lost in the naming. That reaction is understandable. But here is what the list is actually communicating. Each aeon is a real quality of the Pleroma: mind paired with truth, word paired with life, humanity paired with church. These pairings are describing the internal relational logic of what fullness actually contains. The Pleroma is not a featureless infinite. It has structure, it has differentiation. It is simultaneously unified, the monad underlying everything, and inexhaustibly articulate. Every quality you could associate with genuine being, intelligence, truth, creative expression, vitality, the capacity for relationship, the recognition of what is human, all of these exist in the Pleroma, not as projections from below, but as original, fully realized dimensions of what it is. The practical weight of this becomes clear when you set it against the material world. The demiurge, when he constructs the material realm, is working from an incomplete and distorted memory of aeonic structures he has never directly experienced. He creates a world that has echoes of aeonic qualities. There is intelligence in the material world, there is something resembling truth, there is creativity and vitality, but these echoes are degraded, finite, and unstable. The material world is not the opposite of the Pleroma. It is a poor copy made by someone who saw the original from a great distance and worked from that fragmentary impression. This is why the Gnostic approach to the material world is not hatred, despite the caricature of Gnosticism as world-hating. It is closer to the feeling you have when you see a beautiful photograph of a landscape you once stood in directly. The photograph is not wrong. It captures something real, but if someone tried to tell you that the photograph was better than the landscape, or equivalent to it, or was in fact all the landscape there ever was, that is where the disagreement begins. The aeons are the landscape. The material world is the photograph. And the pneumatic spark inside you is the memory of having stood there. The story of Sophia is the story of how the Pleroma's interior becomes the material world's exterior. It is the hinge point of the entire Gnostic cosmological narrative. And if you have followed along from the beginning of this video, you already have enough of the architecture in place to understand what actually happens in that story and why it matters. Sophia is the last and youngest of the aeons in the Valentinian system. She is the 30th aeon, the outermost in the progression of divine emanations. And it is precisely her position at the edge of the Pleroma, furthest from the monad in terms of aeonic distance, that makes what happens to her both comprehensible and tragic. The Valentinian account, preserved most completely in Irenaeus's Against Heresies and in fragments of Valentinian texts themselves, describes Sophia as experiencing a desire, not a desire for something external to the Pleroma. There is nothing external to the Pleroma, that's the point, but a desire to know the Father, the monad, directly and completely. To comprehend the incomprehensible, to contain what cannot be contained. This is not presented as moral failure in the simple sense. The Gnostic texts are careful about this. Sophia's desire is itself an expression of her aeonic nature. Wisdom, which is what her name means, has an inherent orientation toward understanding. The tragedy is not that she wanted to know. The tragedy is that the kind of knowing she reached for is structurally impossible at the level of individual aeonic existence. Only the monad knows the monad completely. For anything else to attempt that knowledge directly, without the mediation that the aeonic structure provides, is to reach beyond the boundaries of one's own being. What follows from this reaching, from this act the texts sometimes call the Passion of Sophia, is a production, but not the ordered, paired, intentional kind of production that characterizes normal aeonic emanation. What Sophia produces from this moment of uncontained longing is something formless, incomplete, bearing the characteristics of her passion rather than the characteristics of Pleroma fullness. The Valentinian sources describe this production as akamoth, a name derived from the Hebrew word for wisdom, hokmah, the lower Sophia, a kind of shadow or echo of Sophia's true nature, produced outside the boundaries of the Pleroma and unable to return. This is the moment. This is where matter comes from, not from deliberate creation, not from a good God deciding to build a physical world for good reasons. Matter in the Gnostic account is the crystallization of Sophia's passion. The substrate of the material universe is composed of the condensed residue of a divine being's uncontrolled desire, grief, confusion, and longing. The demiurge, that figure who will later declare himself the only God and construct the world we live in, does not create from nothing. He shapes what is already there. He organizes the emotional debris of Sophia's fall into the ordered but inferior structure we call physical reality. The Apocryphon of John describes this with a specificity that is worth sitting with. The material elements, the heaviness, the inertia, the tendency toward entropy that characterizes physical matter are not neutral properties of a well-made substance. They are the residue of terror and confusion pressed into form. The world is literally constructed from the emotional aftermath of a cosmological trauma. And here is what this means for the pneumatic spark you carry. When Sophia's passion produced Achamoth, it did not produce pure formlessness. Embedded within what Sophia produced was a fragment of what she was, a seed of genuine aeonic light, a trace of real Pleroma consciousness. This fragment passed into the material world through Achamoth and was unknowingly deposited by the demiurge himself into certain human beings when he breathed life into them, in a gesture he borrowed from the divine realm without understanding what he was carrying. This is why the material world contains both prisoners and prison. This is why certain human beings carry within them something that the material world cannot satisfy, explain, or extinguish. The light inside you is not a metaphor for potential or for spiritual aspiration. It is a literal fragment of aeonic consciousness that arrived in the material realm through Sophia's fall and cannot fully acclimatize to the conditions here because those conditions were never its home. This is also why the Gnostic path is not about improving the world, or fixing the material realm, or making the prison more comfortable. The spark does not need better prison conditions. The spark needs to remember what it is, complete the reversal of Sophia's descent, and find its way back to the fullness from which it came, not as an escape from responsibility, but as the only response adequate to what it actually is. One of the most consistently misunderstood aspects of Gnostic cosmology is the nature of the demiurge's relationship to the Pleroma. Most people, encountering the Gnostic system for the first time, assume the demiurge is simply evil, a villain in a cosmic drama, who consciously opposes the good God and works to trap souls out of malice. That reading is wrong, and the correct reading is, in certain ways, more unsettling. The demiurge is not evil in the way that a person can be evil. He is limited in the way that all things are limited, when they operate at the outermost edge of understanding, working from a partial map and mistaking it for the complete territory. The technical Gnostic term for his condition is agnosia, a specific kind of not knowing that does not know it is not knowing. He is, in the Apocryphon of John's framing, the God of this world, and he governs it with genuine conviction. He does not torture souls for sport. He constructs a system that produces suffering as a byproduct of its fundamental incompleteness, and he cannot perceive the incompleteness because he has never seen the Pleroma directly. The Sethian Gnostic texts describe the demiurge's origins in a way that makes this limitation structurally inevitable. He comes into existence through Achamoth, the lower Sophia, herself already displaced from the Pleroma. He has access to the light traces that Achamoth carries, and this gives him genuine creative power, enough to build a cosmos that functions, that sustains life, that has its own forms of order and beauty. But he has no access to the Pleroma itself, and crucially, he does not know this. His famous declaration in several Gnostic texts, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me," is not the boasting of a conscious tyrant. It is the sincere statement of a being who has looked in every direction available to him and genuinely found nothing larger than himself. This is a different kind of horror than the simple villain story. The simple villain story is manageable. The story of a God who is doing his best with a fundamentally inadequate and incomplete understanding of reality, and who in that limitation has constructed a world that reflects his own blindness. That story is harder to hold. Now, here is where the Pleroma's response enters the picture, because the Gnostic sources are not simply describing a cosmological catastrophe with no resolution. The Pleroma does not remain passive when confronted with the situation created by Sophia's fall. This is one of the aspects of Gnostic cosmology that is most frequently glossed over in introductory treatments, and it is one of the most important. The fullness, the complete divine reality, sends responses. It projects help, not through the kind of dramatic intervention that breaks open the material world and forcibly extracts the trapped sparks. That approach would require engaging the demiurge's system on its own terms, which would be to concede to it a reality it does not fully possess. Instead, the Pleroma's strategy is concealment. The texts describe the sending of divine emissaries and figures variously called the Logos, Christ, the Illuminator, into the material realm. But these emissaries do not arrive with blazing cosmic authority that overrides the demiurge's system. They arrive concealed. They wear the forms of the material world, like a garment. They move through the archontic levels without triggering the defense mechanisms those levels have for detecting and neutralizing Pleroma-aligned consciousness. And they make contact specifically with those human beings who carry the pneumatic spark, not by announcing themselves publicly, not by establishing institutions, but through direct transmission that bypasses the normal channels of material world communication. This is the Gnostic understanding of what Jesus was doing, not dying for sins, not purchasing forgiveness through sacrifice in a cosmic legal transaction. Moving through the material world as a concealed Pleroma emissary, making contact with pneumatics, transmitting gnosis direct, experiential, self-authenticating knowledge of what they actually are and then departing. The resurrection, in this reading, is not a bodily return from death that validates a theological claim. It is the emissary completing its transit through the material levels and returning to the Pleroma after the transmission is made. The concealment strategy has a further implication that the Valentinian sources develop with particular care. The gnosis that the emissary carries cannot be received by the material structures of the demiurge's world, the psychic and hylic dimensions of human being that are fully integrated into the material system. It can only be received by the pneumatic spark. This means that gnosis is inherently self-selecting. It does not propagate through institutional power, through argument, through social pressure, or through any of the mechanisms the material world uses to transmit information. It propagates through recognition. The spark responds to its own description. The light inside you knows what it is being shown when it encounters genuine gnosis, because it is not being taught something new. It is being reminded of something it has always known but could not, until that moment, clearly see. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most practically urgent question the Gnostic tradition ever asked. Not where did we come from, we have answered that. Not who built this world, we have answered that too. The question that matters now is, if the pneumatic spark is a fragment of Pleroma consciousness, if it carries within it the direct imprint of the monad's own self-knowing, then why does it not simply remember? Why is the recognition so difficult? Why does it arrive, for most people, as a sudden shock of something long forgotten rather than as a continuous, stable awareness? The Gnostic texts do not treat this as a mystery to be endured. They treat it as a mechanism to be understood. And the mechanism has a name. It is called the forgetting. Not ordinary forgetting, the kind that fades with time. Something structural, something engineered. The Apocryphon of John returns to this question with a specificity that is almost clinical. When the pneumatic spark descends into material embodiment, and here the texts are careful to say that this descent is not a punishment but a consequence of Sophia's error, a ripple effect of the cosmic fracture, it passes through the layers of the demiurge's construction. Each layer is governed by an archon. Each archon, as it passes through its domain, imprints on the descending spark a specific limitation, a specific veil. By the time the spark arrives inside a human body, it has passed through 7 such veils. 7 layers of structural amnesia. The spark is not destroyed. It is not diminished in its essential nature, but it has been wrapped in a series of filters that prevent it from perceiving what it is. Think of it this way. If you place 7 layers of frosted glass between a candle and an observer, the observer is not in darkness. They can perceive light. They know that something is there, but they cannot see the candle clearly. They cannot see its shape, its flame, its source. They experience light as a general atmospheric condition rather than as a specific, knowable thing. This is what the archonic veils do to the pneumatic spark's self-knowledge. The spark inside you is not extinguished. You feel it. You have always felt it. That persistent sense that something more is present beneath the surface of ordinary experience that is not imagination. That is the candle behind the frosted glass, still burning, still precisely what it always was, simply unable to be seen clearly through the material architecture that surrounds it. The Valentinian texts elaborate this further, and here the elaboration becomes personally significant. The veils the archons impose are not arbitrary. They correspond to specific qualities that function as binding agents in material existence. The texts name these in various ways across different manuscripts, but the consistent core is this. They include ignorance of origin, absorption in sensory experience, identification with the body, investment in social persona, fear of death, attachment to the material world's rewards, and the substitution of the demiurge's law for genuine inner knowing. Each of these is not merely a psychological tendency. According to the Valentinian framework, they are structurally imposed through the process of material embodiment. They are the mechanism by which the archonic system maintains its governance over pneumatic consciousness. What this means is that the forgetting is not accidental. It is not the result of time passing or experience accumulating. It is built into the architecture of material incarnation itself. The system is designed, and the Gnostic texts use that word deliberately, designed so that the pneumatic spark will, upon entering material existence, lose clear access to its own nature. This is not cruelty in the narrative. The demiurge does not torture the sparks out of malice in the way a villain tortures captives. The demiurge is, remember, unconscious of the higher reality. He builds what he builds according to his own nature, which is the nature of bounded, self-enclosed power. The forgetting is a byproduct of that architecture. But the effect is the same, a divine fragment, trapped in a material system, unable to clearly perceive what it is, and therefore unable to return. This is why gnosis cannot simply be taught like mathematics. You cannot remove the veils through information alone. Information can point, information can create the conditions for recognition, but the actual moment of recognition, the moment the spark perceives itself that moment, is not a cognitive event. It is what the texts call anamnesis, unforgetting. The sudden collapse of a veil that was never made of thought in the first place. And this is why the Pleroma matters so profoundly to the question of personal liberation. Because the structure of the Pleroma, the specific architecture of what the spark actually is and where it actually comes from, is precisely the information that the forgetting most completely conceals, anamnesis. The word is Greek. It means unforgetting, not learning, not discovery, unforgetting. The distinction is not semantic. It is the entire theological and practical core of what the Gnostic tradition understood itself to be doing. When a Gnostic teacher in the 2nd century sat across from a student and began to describe the Pleroma, its structure, its aeons, the nature of the monad, the descent of Sophia, the construction of the material world, they were not, in their own self-understanding, conveying new information. They were creating the conditions for a specific kind of internal event. They were arranging the frosted glass so that it became, for a moment, transparent. They were holding up a description precise enough that the spark inside the student could recognize its own reflection. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text discovered at Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to somewhere in the 2nd century CE, addresses this directly. It describes ignorance as a kind of nightmare. The text uses dream imagery explicitly from which the pneumatic person must awaken. The waking is not gradual. It does not accumulate through study the way expertise accumulates. It breaks, the way waking from a dream breaks. One moment you are inside the logic of the dream, treating it as real, orienting your decisions and your fears around its contents. The next moment, you are awake, and the dream's logic has not been refuted or argued away. It has simply lost its grip on your perception. You are no longer inside it. This is the Gnostic model of liberation, and it has a specific implication that separates it sharply from almost every other religious framework in the ancient world. In most religious systems, salvation is something done to you or for you by a power outside yourself. A god intervenes, a savior sacrifices, a priest performs a ritual that transfers grace through a sanctioned channel. The Gnostic tradition, rooted in its understanding of the Pleroma and the pneumatic spark, arrives at a completely different conclusion. Salvation, or more precisely, return, is not something done to you, it is something you recognize. The Pleroma does not come to extract you. The recognition of what you already are is the extraction. The Tripartite Tractate, another Nag Hammadi text, lays this out with unusual precision. It distinguishes between the 3 types of human beings we have already encountered, the hylics, the psychics, the pneumatics, and then makes a claim that troubled later readers precisely because of how far it departs from ordinary religious logic. The pneumatic does not need an intermediary, not because the pneumatic is arrogant or self-sufficient in the ordinary sense, but because the pneumatic spark is already, in its essential nature, continuous with the Pleroma from which it came. The intermediary is not the path. The intermediary, the teacher, the text, the practice, is the occasion for recognition. The path, itself, is interior. This is why the viewer comment on our video about the monad's hidden exit struck me as genuinely perceptive. Someone wrote, "Limitations are not fixed. Boundaries are mere boundaries of the forgotten gifts." That is not a decorative sentiment. That is an accurate description of the Gnostic model of what limitations actually are. The constraints the archonic veils impose are real in the sense that they function, that they produce effects, that they genuinely occlude the spark's self-knowledge. but they are not metaphysically ultimate. They are, to use the technical language the texts prefer, imposed rather than constitutive. They are placed on the spark from outside, which means they can, in principle, be removed not by force, not by virtue, not by the accumulation of merit, but by the specific act of recognition that the Gnostic tradition calls gnosis. The mechanics of anamnesis, as described across the Nag Hammadi texts, follow a consistent pattern. There is a first encounter with the material, the teachings, the cosmological framework, the description of the Pleroma, and the spark that does not yet fully land. The person hears it and finds it interesting, perhaps finds it resonant, but the recognition is partial. This is normal. The veils are multiple. The first exposure begins to thin one or two of them. Then something happens. A piece of the teaching returns at an unexpected moment, or a particular phrase suddenly strikes with a force that earlier it did not carry, or a moment of lived experience cracks open in a way that makes the teaching suddenly precise and personally applicable rather than abstractly interesting. And in that moment, something shifts. Not in the external world, not in the teaching itself, which has not changed. Something shifts in the perceiver, a veil lifts. And what was known theoretically becomes known in the way the texts mean when they use the word gnosis directly, immediately, without mediation, without the possibility of arguing yourself back out of it. There is an objection that arrives at this point in any serious engagement with the Gnostic framework, and the tradition anticipated it. If the Pleroma is real, if fullness exists, and is the ultimate nature of things, if the pneumatic spark within you is genuinely continuous with that fullness, then why is there suffering? Not as an abstract theological puzzle, but as something immediate and unignorable. People experience real loss, real pain, real destruction that is not remotely pedagogical. Children die. Good people are broken by systems that reward cruelty. Entire civilizations are swallowed by violence. If the Pleroma is what the texts say it is, if the monad is what the texts say it is, then what is the theological meaning of suffering that feels not like a lesson, but like an assault? The Orthodox Christian tradition answered this question with a theology of divine permission. God allows suffering for reasons that exceed human comprehension, or suffering entered through human free will, or suffering is transformative in ways that will be revealed in eternity. These answers have carried enormous weight for enormous numbers of people, but the Gnostic tradition looked at exactly the same evidence and arrived at a completely different conclusion, not a more comfortable one. In some ways, a harder one. The Gnostic answer is this: suffering is not permitted by the monad. Suffering is not sent by the Pleroma. Suffering exists because the demiurge's world is structurally, constitutively imperfect, not as a test, not as a curriculum, but because it was built by a being who did not know what perfection was. This is what the hypostasis of the archons, a text recovered from the Nag Hammadi library, describes in terms that are almost shockingly direct. The material world does not contain embedded divine purpose in the way mainstream theology assumes. The demiurge's construction has meaning. The trapped pneumatic sparks give it meaning from within, but the structure itself is not authored by wisdom. It is authored by power that does not know its own limitations. And power that does not know its own limitations builds systems that break what they were never designed to contain. The suffering of pneumatic consciousness inside material existence is not a divine plan. It is a structural consequence of the wrong kind of consciousness having built the container. This matters enormously for how the Gnostic tradition understands the emotional experience of suffering. In the mainstream theological framework, to suffer deeply is, in some sense, to be in a relationship with God. The suffering has meaning because God permits it. In the Gnostic framework, to suffer deeply is to be pressing against the limits of the archonic architecture. That is not meaningless. It is, in fact, one of the conditions under which the veil of forgetting thins. Suffering, particularly the kind of suffering that arises from encountering the structural inadequacy of the material world, the experience of the world's inability to satisfy something in you that is real and fundamental. This kind of suffering is, in Gnostic terms, pneumatic. It is the spark pressing against the frosted glass. It is the thing in you that knows this world is insufficient, pushing against a world that cannot acknowledge that it is. Valentinus, whose teaching reached its full expression in Rome around the middle of the 2nd century CE, and whose students produced some of the most sophisticated theological texts the tradition ever generated, distinguished precisely between what he called material suffering and what he called pneumatic longing. Material suffering, pain, loss, disease. The entropy that affects all bodies is real and is not to be dismissed or spiritualized away. He was not teaching his students to pretend that loss does not hurt. Pneumatic longing, however, is something different. It is the specific ache of a consciousness that is not native to this dimension, pressing against the boundaries of a world that cannot contain what it actually is. And this longing, he argued, is not pathology. It is not depression or trauma or existential anxiety in the clinical sense, though it can manifest alongside those things. It is orientation. It is the spark turning toward its source the way a plant turns toward light, instinctively, structurally, because that is what it is built to do. The practical implication of this is significant and worth pausing on. If suffering in the Gnostic framework is not sent by the ultimate divine source as a teaching tool, then the response to suffering is not submission. It is not, "This pain is God's will, and I must receive it with gratitude." The Gnostic response to suffering is recognition, seeing clearly which kind of suffering you are experiencing, understanding its source in the architecture of the material world, and using the clarity that suffering sometimes creates as one of the conditions for anamnesis. Suffering, in this framework, does not redeem you, but it can crack open the veil, and a cracked veil is an opportunity that nothing else in the archonic system can provide. One of the most persistent misunderstandings in popular engagement with the concept of the Pleroma, and I have seen this appear in the comments on our previous video, the 7 levels of the Pleroma reveal, which level is apprided. Your soul from is the assumption that the Pleroma is a place you go after time ends, that it is heaven by another name. That eternity, in the Gnostic context, simply means an extremely long duration. This misunderstanding is understandable. It is the category available to most people raised inside frameworks where time is assumed to be the fundamental structure of existence, and eternity is simply more of it. But the Gnostic tradition does not make that assumption. And the distinction it makes instead is one of the most radical moves in the entire framework. The Pleroma does not exist in time. This is not a poetic statement. It is not metaphor. The Gnostic cosmological model is explicit. Time is a feature of the demiurge's construction. It does not exist in the Pleroma. It does not exist prior to or surrounding the Pleroma. It was generated along with space, matter, causality, and entropy when the demiurge constructed the material world. This means that the Pleroma is not temporally prior to the material world in the way that yesterday is prior to today. It is not that the Pleroma existed first, and then the material world was built afterward, and now both exist sequentially. The Pleroma exists outside the sequential framework entirely. It does not have a before or an after. It simply is, completely, without duration. The Zostriano's text from the Nag Hammadi collection, one of the more philosophically dense documents in the entire library, engages this directly. It describes the Pleroma as existing in what it calls the eternal present, not an endlessly extended now, but a now that has no extension because extension is a temporal concept, and the Pleroma is not subject to time's logic. The aeons of the Pleroma do not exist one after another. They do not experience the passage of time between their emanation and the present moment. The entire structure of the Pleroma, the monad, the paired aeons, the fullness of divine consciousness expressed in infinite self-knowing facets, exists simultaneously, completely, without sequence. Now consider what this means for the pneumatic spark. If the spark's essential nature is continuous with the Pleroma, if it genuinely belongs to the fullness and not to the material world's architecture, then the spark's true nature is also outside time. Not in the sense that it will be outside time eventually, after death or after liberation, but in the sense that the spark's essential nature has never been inside time at all. What is inside time is the material body, the psychic structure, the social persona, the accumulated history of a particular human life. The spark itself, the pneuma, the divine fragment at the innermost center of Gnostic anthropology that is not a temporal entity. It entered the temporal dimension through the process of material embodiment, but it did not thereby become temporal in its essence. It is, to use an analogy the text suggests without quite making explicit, like a match that has been dipped in water. The water is real, the match is genuinely wet. But the combustible core of the match has not become water. It remains capable of fire. The water is the condition it is currently in, not what it is. This has a direct consequence for understanding what return to the Pleroma actually means. In a temporal framework, return would mean the spark travels from the material world back to the Pleroma, across some kind of distance or sequence, ending up somewhere different from where it was. But if the Pleroma is not a temporal or spatial location, if it is a mode of being rather than a place, then return is not travel. Return is, again, recognition. The spark does not go anywhere. It perceives, clearly and without the distortion of the archonic veils, what it already is and what it has always been. In that perceiving, the temporal dimension does not disappear. The body still occupies space and time, but the spark's identification with the temporal dimension loses its exclusive grip. The spark knows itself as what it is, rather than only as what it has been constructed to appear to be. Valentinus described this, according to the accounts preserved in later writers, as the difference between knowing about eternity and knowing from eternity. To know about eternity is to think about a very long time and call it eternal. To know from eternity is to perceive, directly and without mediation, from the standpoint of what you actually are, which is not a temporal entity having an experience of timelessness, but a pleromatic fragment, recognizing that time was always the dream, and this recognition is the waking, not the end of experience. Not the end of the human life being lived, but the end of the confusion about what is ultimately real and what is structurally imposed. This is what the Gnostic tradition meant by liberation, not escape from the world, clarity about the world's nature and your own. So, what does it actually look like, this movement from confusion to clarity? What does Gnostic liberation look like in practice, not in theory? The tradition has a specific word for it: anamnesis, unforgetting, not learning something new, not acquiring information you did not previously possess, but stripping away the accumulated layers of false identification until what was always present becomes visible again. This is not a metaphor. The Gnostic texts are quite precise about the distinction. The pneuma, the divine spark, did not lose its nature when it descended into matter. It lost its awareness of its nature. Those are radically different problems requiring radically different solutions. If the spark had actually been diminished or altered, the solution would be transformation becomes something you are not yet. But if the spark retained its full pleromatic nature and only lost recognition of that nature, then the solution is not transformation. It is remembering. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text composed around 140 CE, describes this with an image that has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it. It describes the pre-Gnostic condition as a nightmare, not a metaphor for a nightmare. An actual nightmare in the sleep of ignorance, where terrifying and disorienting things happen: persecution, confusion, exile, the sense of being trapped in a hostile world that does not recognize you. And then it says, the gnosis comes like someone waking from a dream. The moment of waking is not the acquisition of new experiences inside the dream. It is the sudden, total recognition that the dream was a dream. Everything changes in that moment. Not the content of the dream, the content stays exactly as it was. But the relationship to the content transforms absolutely. What was terrifying becomes simply an image. What was binding becomes structurally inert. What seemed like ultimate reality reveals itself as a temporary construct with no genuine claim on what you are. The excerpts of Theodotus, a collection of Valentinian teachings preserved in the writings of Clement of Alexandria from around 170 CE, frames this as a set of 4 questions whose answers constitute liberation. Who were we? What have we become? Where were we? Where have we been thrown? And the corresponding movement forward. Where are we hastening? From what have we been redeemed? What is birth? What is rebirth? These are not abstract philosophical questions in this tradition. They are diagnostic. A physician who does not know what the patient was before the illness, what the illness is, and what health looks like, cannot prescribe a cure. Anamnesis functions as both diagnosis and cure simultaneously, because the recognition of what you are is itself the liberation. You do not recognize your pleromatic origin and then undergo a separate process of liberation. The recognition is the liberation. Now, practically speaking, and this is where I want to be careful, because the texts themselves are careful here, anamnesis is not achievable through intellectual effort alone. You can understand the cosmological framework completely. You can trace the emanation of every aeon from the monad. You can map the structure of the Pleroma with precision. You can explain Sophia's fall and the demiurge's misapprehension and the nature of the archons with academic fluency. And none of that understanding is anamnesis. The dialogue of the Savior, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts and dating to approximately the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, draws this distinction clearly. Knowledge about the divine structure is preparatory. It creates the conceptual scaffolding within which recognition can occur. but the recognition itself is an event, direct, immediate, experiential. The text describes it as the difference between hearing about light and having your eyes opened in the presence of light. This is why the Gnostic tradition always included, alongside its cosmological teaching, a set of practices, meditation, ritual, prayer forms, specific visualization disciplines that were designed not to create gnosis, but to prepare the ground for it. The cosmological map orients you. The practices quiet the noise of the false self. And then, if the tradition is to be believed, the recognition occurs. Not because you earned it or manufactured it, but because you removed what was blocking it. One viewer comment on our video about the 7 levels of the Pleroma put it in a way that stopped me completely. They wrote, "Level 4 isn't as much fun as some might think. I spend so much time with a feeling of fullness in my brain, a deep need to push all the ideas out." That is not someone describing a philosophical position. That is someone describing a direct experiential pressure, the pneuma straining against its container, the pleromatic nature pressing against the boundaries of ordinary consciousness, looking for the crack in the ceiling through which it can recognize itself. Anamnesis does not always arrive quietly. Sometimes it arrives as that pressure. That fullness that has nowhere to go, that relentless sense that the inside of you is larger than the outside of you can hold. There is a question that has broken theological systems for 2,000 years. If God is omnipotent and perfectly good, why does evil exist? Why does suffering exist? Why does a world created by an all-knowing, all-loving divine being contain not just natural disasters and death, but specifically the kind of grinding, systemic, arbitrary suffering that destroys the innocent and rewards the cruel? Orthodox theology calls this the problem of evil. Theologians have spent centuries attempting to solve it: free will theodicy, soul-making theodicy, the greater good argument, the incomprehensibility of divine purpose argument. Every single one of these solutions requires the thinker to accept some form of the premise that the creator of this world is ultimately good and that suffering serves some divinely sanctioned purpose we may not be able to perceive. The Gnostic tradition does not accept that premise, and by refusing it, it dissolves the problem entirely. If the creator of the material world is not the highest God, if the demiurge is a limited, self-deceived entity who built this world from corrupted matter and governed it through archons, who enforce ignorance rather than liberation, then there is no problem of evil requiring a theodicy. Evil exists because the creator of this realm is not good in the full sense. Not evil in the way a malicious villain is evil, but structurally deficient, limited, operating from a diminished conception of reality and imposing that diminished conception on everything within its jurisdiction. The Apocryphon of John describes the demiurge called Yaldabaoth in that text as declaring, "I am God and there is no other God beside me." And the text's response to that declaration is withering. It identifies this claim as the precise expression of his ignorance. He declares himself the only God because he cannot perceive what lies beyond the boundary of his own creation. He is not lying in the way a conscious deceiver lies. He is stating what he genuinely believes. And what he genuinely believes is wrong because the Pleroma, the fullness of divine reality from which even he ultimately derives his existence, entirely exceeds his comprehension. This means suffering in the Gnostic framework is not a mystery requiring faith. It is a structural consequence requiring understanding. This world produces suffering because it was built by a limited architect using corrupted materials under conditions of fundamental ignorance about the nature of ultimate reality. You do not need to reconcile that suffering with divine goodness. You need to understand its source and your relationship to it. And this is where the pleromatic understanding becomes not just theologically interesting but existentially transformative. If the pneuma within you is genuinely pleromatic, if what you fundamentally are exists at the level of the fullness, not at the level of the demiurgic creation, then the suffering you experience is real as experience, but not ultimately constitutive of what you are. This is not a call to dismiss suffering or bypass it with spiritual bypassing. The texts do not say, "The suffering is an illusion, ignore it." They say, "The suffering is real within its domain, and your domain is larger than the domain in which the suffering operates." The On the Origin of the World, another Nag Hammadi text, makes a point that I find remarkable for its directness. It observes that the archons created a world in which death appears to be the ultimate authority. Everything in this realm is organized around the fact of biological death, social structures, religious institutions, political systems, the entire architecture of human fear and compliance. Death is the ultimate enforcer of archontic control. If you can be killed, and you know you can be killed, the threat of death shapes your behavior absolutely. But if the pneuma, the divine spark, does not die when the body dies, then death's authority is a bluff. A real and painful bluff within the material domain. But a bluff with respect to what you ultimately are. The Pleroma does not have a death structure because the Pleroma does not have a time structure, and death is a temporal event. What does not exist in time cannot die within time. This is not consolation theology. This is not, there is life after death, so do not worry. This is a structural claim about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to material conditions. The tradition is saying, your fear of death is appropriate to the material level of your existence and completely inappropriate to the pleromatic level of your existence. And the task of Gnosis is to understand, with the kind of understanding that changes behavior rather than just satisfying curiosity, which level you are actually operating from in any given moment. The problem of evil, in the Gnostic resolution, becomes the problem of mistaken identity. We suffer as much as we do because we have forgotten what we are and therefore cannot correctly locate ourselves in the structure of reality. Everything covered in this script so far has been, in some sense, cosmological and historical. The structure of the Pleroma, the emanation of the aeons, the nature of Sophia's departure and return, the Demiurge's creation, the Archon's governance, the nature of Gnosis and anamnesis. These are teachings, frameworks, maps. Maps are not the territory. And the Gnostic tradition, at every level, is clear that the map is not the destination. So what does the Pleroma actually demand of you, specifically, right now, in the life you are living? I want to be honest here in a way that I think a lot of spiritual content is not. My name is Marcus, and I have been studying these texts for years, not as a scholar looking for a dissertation, but as someone who encountered them at a particular moment in my life, when the consensus version of reality had stopped making sense to me, not in a dramatic way, not a sudden crisis. It was a slower erosion. The feeling that the frameworks I had been given to understand my life, religious, psychological, cultural, were describing something real, but something smaller than what I was actually experiencing. Like being handed a map for a city I did not live in and being told it was a map of my city, and spending years trying to make the streets match. The Gnostic text did not solve that problem by replacing one map with another. What they did, and what the concept of the Pleroma specifically did, was help me understand why any map of the material world would always feel insufficient, not because I was broken or spiritually superior or chosen, but because there is a dimension of what I am that genuinely does not fit within the boundaries of the material world's descriptive frameworks, not as a poetic sentiment, as a structural fact about the nature of consciousness and its pleromatic origin. That was not comforting in the way people expect spiritual insight to be comforting. It was initially more disorienting, because if the Pleroma is real and you are genuinely a fragment of it, then the stakes of this life shift in ways that are both liberating and demanding. Liberating because the ultimate horizon of your existence is not the grave. Demanding because you cannot pretend, once you understand this, that the choices you make in this life are trivial. How you treat the pneuma in others, how you either serve or obstruct the process of anamnesis in the people around you, becomes weighted with a seriousness that casual spirituality does not carry. The Gnostic texts are not uniformly world-denying. That is one of the great misreadings of the tradition. Yes, they describe the material world as a prison constructed by a limited creator, but they do not instruct the Gnostic to therefore disengage from the world, to abandon relationships, to treat human suffering as irrelevant because it is only a dream. The Sophia narrative itself, which we covered in full in the video titled The Full Story of Gnostic Sophia, Every Gnostic Must Know, this makes clear that the divine participates actively in the work of restoration. Sophia does not abandon the material world once she perceives its nature. She works within it, through the figures she inspires and the pneuma she supports, toward the return of every divine spark to the fullness. That is the model, engaged clarity, not detached indifference and not desperate involvement. The precise combination of knowing that this world is not the ultimate reality and nevertheless taking it seriously, because the beings within it, including the people immediately around you, are carrying pleromatic fragments that deserve to be treated as such. What the Pleroma demands, in the most practical terms I can give you, is this: stop organizing your life entirely around the material world's definitions of success, security, and significance, and start including, as a genuine and non-negotiable variable in your choices, the reality of what you actually are at the deepest level. This does not mean quit your job and meditate in a cave. It means every significant choice you make, how you spend your time, what relationships you invest in, what work you give your energy to, what you are willing to compromise, and what you are not, should be made with at least some awareness that the calculus extends beyond this life, beyond this body, beyond the metrics the demiurgic world uses to evaluate a successful existence. The tripartite tractate, one of the longer and more philosophically sophisticated texts found at Nag Hammadi, describes the pleromatic origin as both the source of the pneumatic person's restlessness and the explanation for their eventual rest. The restlessness is appropriate. It is the pneuma pressing against the walls of a container too small for it. The rest, what the tradition calls the return to the pleroma, is not the end of personhood, but its completion, its recognition of what it always was. You are not building toward that completion from scratch. You are remembering your way back to something that never stopped being true. We began this with a set of claims that the pleroma is not a metaphor, that it is not spiritual poetry for people who like the feeling of being special, that it is a precise, systematically developed, historically documented cosmological and soteriological framework with specific implications for how you understand your consciousness, your suffering, and your ultimate nature. Having moved through the full structure from the monad's initial self-awareness, through the emanation of the aeons, through Sophia's departure and the catastrophe it initiated, through the demiurge's construction of the material world, through the embedding of the divine spark in human beings, through the archontic systems that enforce forgetfulness, through the nature of gnosis and anamnesis, through the pleromatic understanding of time and evil and liberation, I want to be direct about what all of this actually changes, not what it might change, not what it could theoretically mean, what changes specifically, structurally, and in ways the tradition treats as practically significant. First, your relationship to your own sense of incompleteness changes. The chronic, low-level sense that something is missing, that this life, even at its best, does not quite reach the register of reality you dimly sense, exists, is no longer a symptom of psychological deficiency or spiritual immaturity. It is a correct perception. The material world is genuinely insufficient relative to the pleroma. The longing is appropriate. Not because you are broken, but because you are pleromatic and you are currently living in a non-pleromatic environment. The homesickness is accurate navigation, not neurosis. Second, your relationship to institutional religious authority changes. Not because all religious institutions are corrupt, or all religious teaching is false, that would be too simple, and the Gnostic tradition is not simple. But because you now have a framework that allows you to evaluate religious teaching by a criterion the institutions themselves rarely invite. Does this teaching bring you closer to the direct recognition of your own divine nature, or does it interpose itself between you and that recognition, making itself the necessary mediator? The Gnostic tradition, across every school, across every text, consistently insists that gnosis is direct, immediate, between you and the pleroma, with no institution required as an intermediary. That is a criterion with teeth. Third, your relationship to suffering changes, not in the sense that suffering becomes less painful, in the sense that it becomes correctly located. Suffering is real within the domain where it operates. It is not ultimate. The domain where it operates, the material world, demiurgic creation, the space governed by archontic structures, is not the whole of reality. It is a subset that is real and that demands a compassionate and serious response, but a subset whose ultimate authority over what you are is exactly zero. Fourth, your relationship to other people changes. If every human being is a potential carrier of the pneuma, if the divine spark is embedded in human beings as a general condition of pleromatic nature, pressing itself into the material world through whatever apertures it can find, then every person you encounter is, at minimum, possibly housing a fragment of the same fullness you are. That is not a sentimental observation. That is a cosmological claim with ethical implications. The Gnostic, who understands the pleroma and then treats the people around them with contempt or indifference, has missed something fundamental. The fullness. Your relationship to this specific existence, this body, this lifetime, These specific circumstances changes from one of either desperate clinging or resentful endurance to something more like a considered engagement. You are here. The pneuma is here, embedded in this particular form, navigating this particular set of material conditions, in this particular slice of what passes for time in the demiurgic world. That is not an accident to be escaped as quickly as possible. It is a circumstance within which the work of anamnesis is happening or not happening right now, in real time, through the choices and the quality of attention you bring to your actual life. The Pleroma is not waiting for you after death. It is not a reward you receive when this is over. The tradition's most radical and most consistently expressed claim is that the Pleroma is what you are, not what you were before this life, not what you will be after it. What you are, fully, right now, underneath the imposed layers of archontic conditioning and hylic identification and the dream of material permanence. Anamnesis unforgetting is the recognition of that. Not once, not in a single overwhelming mystical event that settles everything forever, but progressively, incrementally, and sometimes without warning, in moments of unusual clarity, in the experience of genuine encounter with another person's depth, in the sensation that has no adequate name in ordinary language, the sensation of suddenly perceiving, from the inside, that what you are has no edges, no age, no expiration, and no distance from the source from which everything that truly exists eternally pours. That is the Pleroma. That is the full story. And now you have it.